Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable, the lights grow a little softer, and the long stories written across our planet are allowed to unfold at an unhurried pace. Tonight, we're travelling to a dry stretch of southeastern California, close to the Colorado River, where the ground itself carries a collection of enormous figures. They do not stand above the desert like statues. They do not rise from ruined walls or wait inside a museum beneath carefully adjusted lighting. They lie flat against the earth, formed by lines of lighter soil surrounded by dark stones, so large that a person walking beside them may see only a narrow path and never realize that the path is part of a human arm, an animal's back, or the outline of a body more than 100 feet long. These are the Blythe Intaglios, a group of giant ground drawings found north of the city of Blythe, near the lower Colorado River. There are human shapes, animal forms, and a spiral. The largest human figure stretches roughly 171 feet from head to foot. That is longer than many buildings are tall, although considerably less convenient if you are looking for somewhere to put an elevator. From the ground, the scale is difficult to understand. From above, the figures become clear. Arms extend outward. Legs separate beneath long bodies. Animals stand beside human forms as if they belong to the same story, though the details of that story were never written down in a language archaeologists can simply translate. Before we move farther into the desert, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere surrounded by city lights, somewhere near open fields, or perhaps somewhere dry enough that the landscape outside your window looks a little like the place we're about to visit? And what time is it where you are? There is something fitting about people in different parts of the world gathering around the same old mystery, each of us sitting beneath a different portion of the night, while these figures remain where they have rested for centuries under the California sun. If you find this kind of slow journey soothing, interesting, or simply useful, when the day has been a little too noisy, you might consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps this quiet corner of the internet reach others who enjoy learning about ancient places without being shouted at by dramatic music every 12 seconds. There will be mystery here, certainly, but we can approach it calmly. The desert has waited a very long time. It is unlikely to become impatient with us now. So settle in, allow your thoughts to slow, and imagine a broad gravel terrace above the Colorado River. The air is dry. Low mountains sit along the horizon. The soil is covered by dark pebbles that have been exposed to sunlight and weather for generations. At first, the ground seems plain. There are no columns, no carved doorways, and no obvious sign that anyone once treated this place as important. Yet a few steps away, a pale line crosses the darker surface. It may be several feet wide. It continues farther than expected, then turns. Another line runs beside it. Only from a distance does the arrangement begin to make sense. This is part of what makes the Blythe Intaglios so unusual. Most human objects are designed to meet us at our own scale. A doorway is made for a body. A bowl fits into two hands. A path is meant to be walked. Even a large temple usually reveals its basic shape to someone standing nearby. These figures do not cooperate in quite the same way. They are visible from the ground, of course, but their complete forms are difficult to take in unless the observer reaches a higher position or views them from the air. The people who created them did not have aircraft, observation towers, or convenient viewing platforms with a small cafe at the top. They worked at ground level, arranging shapes far larger than themselves and trusting a plan that could not easily be checked from above. That simple fact has encouraged many questions. How did the makers keep the proportions consistent? Did they use cords, stakes, measured footsteps, or a carefully directed group of workers? Did one person guide the design while others moved the stones? Were the shapes planned in advance? Or did they grow through repeated ceremonies and repairs? Were they intended to be seen as complete images at all? Or was the act of moving through them more important than viewing them? The word intaglio usually refers to a design cut into a surface. Here, the cutting was not done with a chisel against stone. The figures were made by removing the dark, weathered pebbles from the desert pavement and exposing the lighter ground beneath. Stones could also be pushed outward to mark the edges. The result was a negative image, not something built upward, but something revealed by clearing part of the surface away. It sounds simple, and in a basic sense it is. No enormous blocks had to be lifted. No metal tools were required. Yet simple methods can produce difficult work when the design covers an area longer than a modern passenger aircraft. The dark coating on many desert stones is often called desert varnish. It develops slowly through interactions involving minerals, dust, moisture, and microorganisms. Whatever its exact local appearance, the contrast between darker surface material and lighter soil beneath allowed the makers to draw on the landscape without using paint. Their line survived because the region is dry and because desert surfaces can remain relatively stable when left undisturbed. The same dry conditions that make life difficult can also preserve marks that would disappear quickly in wetter places. A field in a rainy climate may hide old tracks beneath grass and soil within a short time. In the Colorado desert, a cleared line can remain visible far longer, assuming people, vehicles, erosion, and curious boots do not interfere. And people have interfered. Once the figures became widely known, visitors walked across them, drove near them, and sometimes damaged the fragile surfaces without understanding how easily the lines could be disturbed. Fences were eventually placed around the best-known figures to reduce further harm. The barriers may not look especially mysterious, but they serve a practical purpose. Ancient ground art does not repair itself after someone decides that a shortcut across the torso would be more convenient than walking around. The protected group includes 6 distinct figures at 3 nearby locations, a human figure at each location, animal forms at 2, and a spiral associated with the group. The human figures vary in size, but all are enormous by ordinary standards. Their bodies are long and simplified. They have heads, arms, legs, and broad sections of torso, but they are not portraits in the familiar sense. We cannot study a face and identify a particular individual. We cannot point to clothing, tools, or a written name. The forms are reduced to the features needed to make a body recognizable across a huge patch of gravel. That lack of detail can make them seem more mysterious than a carved statue covered with symbols. A statue may provide clues through hairstyle, jewellery, weapons, posture, or inscriptions. A ground figure gives us an outline and asks us to do the rest. The temptation is to fill the empty space with whatever story feels most exciting. Ancient giants, visitors from the sky, secret maps, lost civilizations, messages meant for beings who could look down from above. Human beings are remarkably skilled at producing explanations when evidence becomes quiet, and we are even more skilled when the explanation would look good on a thumbnail. The more careful approach begins with the people whose histories belong to the lower Colorado River. According to information presented by the Bureau of Land Management, Mojave and Quechan traditions connect the human figures with Mastamho, a creator associated with life and the shaping of the land, while the animal figures have been linked with Hatakulia, one of the mountain lion beings involved in creation. These associations do not turn every question into a simple answer, and indigenous traditions should not be treated as decorative additions to an archaeological puzzle. They are part of the living cultural setting of the place. The figures stand within a landscape that native communities knew, travelled, named, and understood, long before outsiders began documenting it from airplanes. This changes the way we should look at the site. It is easy to describe the Intaglios as if they appeared in an empty desert, waiting for modern observers to discover them. But the desert was never empty. The Colorado River supported communities, travel routes, farming, fishing, trade, ceremony, and stories tied to particular mountains and stretches of land. What looked vacant to newcomers was already a known world. The absence of stone cities or large permanent buildings did not mean the absence of history. It meant that history had been recorded in different ways, through trails, cleared ground, oral tradition, gathering places, and relationships between people and the landscape. The river itself is central to that setting. The Colorado moves through an environment that often appears almost too dry for a river of its size. Along its course, water creates a narrow corridor of vegetation and life. Cottonwoods, willows, marshes, fish, birds, and cultivated areas once mark the floodplain in ways later altered by dams, irrigation, and settlement. For people living along the lower river, this was not simply a useful source of water. It was a route, a boundary, a provider, and part of the structure of the world. The Intaglios lie on terraces beyond the active floodplain, high enough to avoid being regularly erased by the river. Their position offered stable ground and wide open space. The nearby mountains, desert tracks, and river corridor would have helped people orient themselves. A figure placed there was not floating in an anonymous wilderness. It belonged to a network of meaningful places. Even if we cannot reconstruct every ceremony or journey connected with it, we can understand that location mattered. There is also something important in the amount of labour involved. Scraping aside pebbles does not sound as demanding as raising a pyramid, but scale changes the calculation. A line extending for dozens of feet requires planning, repeated movement, and cooperation. If the figures were maintained or renewed over time, the work may have involved generations. The creation of the image may have been only one part of its purpose. People could have walked along the outlines, danced nearby, gathered at certain times, told stories, mourned, taught younger members of the community, or marked a place connected to events in sacred history. Archaeologists have considered ceremonial explanations partly because trails, cleared areas, circles, and other features occur near some lower Colorado River geoglyphs, yet it is difficult to assign one function to every figure. A symbol can serve several purposes at once. A church can be a place of worship, community, memory, music, and architecture. A family photograph can record a face, mark a relationship, preserve an event, and remind someone of a person who is gone. Ancient landscape art may have been just as layered. Age is another problem. Estimates for the Blythe figures vary widely, often placing them somewhere between several hundred and around 2,000 years old. Dating a cleared patch of desert is much harder than dating a wooden beam or a cooking fire. The stones themselves are older than the design. The soil beneath is older. The image was created by rearranging existing material, and that action may leave few objects suitable for direct dating. Later, people may also have refreshed the lines, moved stones, or added features. The figure we see today could preserve more than one moment of activity. Researchers have attempted to use methods involving rock varnish, associated deposits, and radiocarbon samples, but the results leave room for debate. This uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It is a realistic reflection of what the evidence can support. Scientific dating is not a machine into which an ancient place is placed before a receipt emerges with the exact day of construction. Different materials require different methods, and some sites simply resist precision. The Blythe Intaglios are particularly good at resisting it. Their makers left no known inscription explaining who organised the work or why. This is often described as a mystery, and it is, but not necessarily because all knowledge vanished. Part of the difficulty comes from the way modern research has historically separated physical evidence from indigenous knowledge. Early investigators often treated native people as sources of folklore rather than as communities with intellectual traditions, historical memory, and continuing connections to the land. In other cases, cultural knowledge may have been private, restricted, changed through displacement, or disrupted by disease and colonial violence. Silence in a written archive does not always mean silence in the past. The name Blythe Intaglios also reflects a modern map more than an ancient identity. Blythe is the nearby city by which outsiders locate the site. The figures were made long before the modern town developed, before highways crossed the desert, and before the state line between California and Arizona divided the region in its current political form. The makers would not have thought of themselves as creating a tourist stop in Riverside County. They worked within a different map, one defined by river crossings, mountains, settlements, kinship, resources and stories. Standing near the figures today, a visitor encounters several versions of the landscape at once. There is the ancient surface, the indigenous cultural world, the archaeological site, the protected historic landmark, and the modern desert crossed by roads and aircraft. A fence may separate the viewer from the lines. Vehicles can be heard in the distance. The sun remains entirely committed to making hats seem like a good idea. Yet beneath all the modern additions, the basic visual effect survives. Dark gravel, pale, cleared earth, a body stretched across the ground. The human figures are sometimes compared with the Nazca lines of Peru, and the comparison is understandable. Both involve enormous designs made on dry land by moving darker surface material to reveal lighter ground. Both are easier to appreciate from above. Both have inspired speculation about sky viewers and lost knowledge, but comparisons can also flatten important differences. The Blythe figures belong to the cultural and environmental history of the lower Colorado River, not to Peru. Their meanings must be approached through the peoples, traditions and archaeology of that region, rather than borrowed from a more famous site thousands of miles away. Still, the fact that widely separated societies created huge ground images tells us something interesting about human imagination. People do not always make art at the scale of the hand or the household. Sometimes they use hillsides, plains, stones and paths. They transform space itself into an image. The viewer may not be one person standing at one perfect spot. The audience may include a gathered community, travellers moving through the area, future generations, spiritual beings, ancestors, or the land itself. This is where the question in our title becomes more complicated. Who carved these giant figures into the American desert? The easiest answer would be a name, a culture, and a date. We would place the makers into a neat box, print a label, and continue on our way feeling pleasantly informed. The real answer is less tidy. The figures are closely tied to the indigenous history of the lower Colorado River and are interpreted through Mojave and Quechan creation traditions. Yet the identity of the specific people who first cleared each line, the exact dates, the sequence of construction, and the full range of meanings remain uncertain. That uncertainty does not leave us with nothing. We know the figures were made intentionally. We know the dark desert surface was moved to expose lighter soil. We know their size required planning. We know they stand near a river corridor occupied and travelled by native peoples for a very long time. We know oral traditions connect similar forms and landscapes with powerful creator beings and ceremonial histories. We also know that later outsiders did not immediately recognise what lay beneath them, even when roads and journeys brought them close. Imagine walking across this ground before the figures were fenced. You might follow a line without understanding it. Perhaps you would notice that stones had been pushed aside. Perhaps the pale strip would look too regular to be natural. But without elevation, the whole design would remain hidden by its own size. A person can be too close to something to see it, which is not only true in archaeology, but also explains a fair amount of human behaviour before breakfast. For the makers, however, complete visibility from above may not have been necessary. They could understand the design through planning, memory and movement. A person walking the outline knew where the arm turned, where the leg began, and where the animal stood. The image could exist in the mind and in the activity around it, not only as a picture seen from the sky. Modern viewers often assume that art is made primarily to be looked at. Many forms of art are also made to be performed, entered, touched, renewed, or used. The Blythe Intaglios may therefore be less like drawings on paper and more like places shaped for repeated human action. Their lines could guide movement. Their open spaces could gather people. Their scale could separate ordinary activity from ceremony. The process of remaking the outline might itself have mattered. A figure maintained across generations becomes a link between those who first shaped it and those who returned later. None of this removes the mystery. It simply gives the mystery a more grounded form. We do not need aircraft from another world or a vanished race of giants to explain how the figures were constructed. Human beings with simple tools, careful planning, shared knowledge, and strong reasons can accomplish astonishing things. The difficult question is not whether people were capable of making the intaglios. They clearly were. The difficult question is what the work meant to them and how much of that meaning can still be recovered without forcing the site into a story it never belonged to. For decades, outsiders have approached the figures from above, through photographs, maps, surveys, and flights. That aerial view made the site famous. It also shaped the modern mystery by creating the impression that the images had been waiting for aircraft before they could finally be seen. But long before a pilot crossed this part of the desert, the figures were already known within a human landscape. People had walked around them, perhaps walked through them, and carried stories connected with the beings they represented. The modern story begins when someone in the air looked down and noticed that the pale lines were not random tracks. They joined into bodies. The desert floor, which had seemed empty from a distance, suddenly became a vast picture. That moment would lead to surveys, photographs, public attention, damage, protection, and decades of debate. It would also give the figures a new audience, one that asked who made them while rarely beginning with the people who had always lived along the river. To understand how the Blythe Intaglios entered modern records, we need to climb into the open sky of the early 1930s, when flights across the American Southwest were still unusual enough to feel adventurous, and the view from an aircraft could reveal shapes that roads had passed without noticing. Somewhere between the desert mountains and the Colorado River, a pilot glanced downward, and the ground looked back in the form of a giant human body. From the ground, the desert north of Blythe offers very little warning that enormous human and animal figures are lying nearby. A traveller sees gravel terraces, low scrub, dry washes, distant mountains, and the broad valley of the Colorado River. The surface appears rough but ordinary. Pale tracks run through darker stones. Some curve, some stop. Others seem to wander beyond the distance at which the eye can follow them. Unless a person already knows where to look, the lines can easily be mistaken for paths, disturbed soil, or the remains of vehicle tracks. The image is simply too large to fit comfortably into the view from one pair of human eyes standing at ground level. That problem changed when aircraft began crossing the lower Colorado River region. In the early 1930s, flying across the American desert was still a very different experience from taking a modern passenger flight. Aircraft travelled lower, navigation relied heavily on visible landmarks, maps, compass headings, and the pilot's ability to read the terrain below. There were no glowing screens politely announcing that the aircraft was currently passing over a cultural landmark and that refreshments would be available shortly. Mountains, rivers, roads, railways, and settlements mattered because they helped a pilot understand exactly where the aircraft was. The desert also demanded attention for a more practical reason. Pilots often watched for places where an emergency landing might be possible. A flat terrace or dry lake could be useful if an engine developed trouble. A field that looks smooth from the air might become far less inviting upon closer inspection, especially if it was filled with rocks, gullies, or vegetation determined to introduce itself to the landing gear. Looking down was therefore not sightseeing, it was part of staying alive. One documented account says that in 1932, a flying businessman named George Palmer was searching the terrain for a possible emergency landing place when he noticed the enormous figures below. Some later versions place the event in late 1931 or describe slightly different routes, but the first publicised discovery and official investigation took place in 1932. Palmer's attention had been drawn to pale shapes spread across the dark gravel terraces near the Colorado River. From his position above them, disconnected marks joined together. A long cleared area became a torso. Lines became arms and legs. Nearby shapes became four-legged animals and spirals. What looked meaningless from the ground became unmistakably deliberate from the air. It must have been a strange view. The figures were not small symbols that happened to be visible from an aircraft. They occupied large sections of the terrace. One human form extended well over 100 feet. Its arms reached outward across the gravel. A neighbouring animal appeared almost as if it were standing beside the person. The contrast between the dark desert varnish and the lighter, exposed soil made the outlines visible, although the exact clarity would have depended on altitude, sunlight, shadows, and the angle from which the aircraft approached. Palmer was almost certainly not the first human being to see the figures from above. People could have viewed them from nearby slopes, and anyone involved in their creation understood their arrangement without needing an aircraft. Nor was he the first person to know they existed. Indigenous communities along the lower Colorado River already lived within the cultural landscape to which these figures belonged. Local residents may also have known of the cleared forms before the flight. What changed was that Palmer recognized their enormous complete shapes from the air and brought them into the attention of museums, government officials, newspapers, and the wider non-Indigenous public. This distinction matters because the word discovery can behave rather carelessly. It often makes an old place sound as though it did not exist until an outsider noticed it. A pilot looking down in 1932 did not create the figures, give them their first meaning, or introduce them to the people whose ancestors had lived beside the river. He introduced them to a modern system of documentation. That was an important event, but it was not the beginning of their story. Palmer's report led to aerial photography and archaeological attention. The United States Army Air Corps became involved, producing vertical photographs of the site in April of 1932. These images were valuable because they captured the figures from directly above and recorded details that would later be altered or damaged. Long before satellites and digital mapping made overhead images easy to obtain, aerial photography gave archaeologists a new tool for understanding very large features. A photograph could be studied repeatedly, measured, traced, and compared with observations on the ground. The desert no longer had to be understood only one footstep at a time. The first archaeologist to study and report on the site was Arthur Woodward, then associated with the Los Angeles Museum. Woodward worked with the assistance of the Army Air Corps and visited the figures shortly after the aerial photographs were taken. He described them as gigantic intaglio pictographs, a phrase that managed to be accurate while also sounding like something one might announce before unveiling a particularly ambitious carpet. Woodward's task was not simply to look at an image and declare it unusual. He had to reach the location, inspect the disturbed gravel, measure the forms, compare what could be seen on the ground with what appeared in the photographs, and consider whether the shapes were truly ancient constructions or some more recent alteration. Desert surfaces contain natural lines, animal tracks, washes, footpaths, vehicle marks, and the traces of human work from many periods. Large scale alone does not prove age, and unusual appearance does not automatically make something ceremonial. The aerial photographs offered a guide. From above, Woodward could see that the figures occurred in groups on dark gravel terraces. On the ground, he found that their lighter interiors had been created by clearing away the varnish surface pebbles. The displaced material formed low ridges around parts of the outlines. These were not lines painted onto the surface, they were changes made within the surface itself. One early description counted at least 7 figures, 3 humans, 2 four-legged animals, and 2 spirals arranged at 3 locations. Modern public information usually describes 6 distinct protected figures, partly because the identification and condition of certain features have changed over time. This is a reminder that archaeological sites are not always fixed collections that remain perfectly stable after someone numbers them. Features fade, reports differ, damage occurs, and later researchers may disagree about whether a faint mark is part of an original design, a separate feature, or a disturbance created much later. The 1932 photographs became especially important because they recorded the terraces before decades of tourism, roads, vehicles and vandalism altered them further. When researchers returned in later years, they could compare newer conditions with the earlier images. Tyre tracks, scratches and defaced sections that might otherwise have been mistaken for old features could sometimes be recognised as modern changes. Curiously, the early photographs also contained evidence that the place had not been completely unknown before Palmer's flight. At least one set of vehicle tracks appeared in the images, apparently made before Woodward's party arrived by automobile. A later published study noted the testimony of a long-time Palo Verde Valley resident named James Walters, who said he had known of the indigenous rock pictures north of Blythe for decades. The flight, then, was less a moment when a totally forgotten place returned from oblivion, and more a moment when local knowledge suddenly entered newspapers, museums, and official records. That is how many so-called discoveries happen. A place may be known to ranchers, travellers, local families, and indigenous communities, yet remain absent from academic publications. Then someone arrives with a camera, a government position, or access to a newspaper, and the knowledge becomes official. The difference is not always who saw the place first. It is whose account travelled far enough to be preserved in institutional files. Once the figures were photographed, the aerial view began shaping how outsiders interpreted them. Their dependence on height seemed astonishing. Why would ancient people create something so large that it was difficult to see from the ground? This question felt even stranger in the 1930s, when aviation itself still carried an air of novelty. Looking from an aircraft changed the relationship between people and the landscape. Farms became patterns, roads became thin lines, rivers revealed broad curves invisible from their banks. Entire towns could be understood as plans rather than collections of streets. The Blythe figures seemed to belong naturally to this new perspective. A modern observer might imagine that they had been waiting for the invention of flight, which is a dramatic idea, but not a necessary one. The creators did not need to view the entire image from directly above. They could plan it with stakes and chords. They could measure distances by footsteps. They could work from a sketch or from instructions carried through memory. They could stand on slightly higher ground where part of a form became visible. More importantly, seeing the whole figure as a picture may not have been the main purpose. Aerial vision tends to turn a place into an object. It lets the observer say, "There is the figure, complete and contained." Ground-level experience may have been very different. A person could walk along an arm, move around a torso, enter a cleared circle, or approach an animal form from a particular direction. The shape could be understood through motion rather than through one perfect view. Think of walking through a large garden maze. You do not need to float above it to know that it has a design. You experience the design by following it, although floating would admittedly reduce the amount of time spent pretending you meant to take the wrong turn. The pilot's perspective therefore revealed one truth about the figures, but not necessarily the only truth. It showed their outlines. It did not show the ceremonies that may have occurred there, the words people spoke, the routes they followed, or the reasons they returned. An aerial photograph freezes the ground. Human activity gives it context. Woodward's early work was publicised quickly. In August of 1932, the Los Angeles Times Sunday magazine carried an article asking what ancient people had fashioned the titanic desert figures. In September, Woodward published an account in the Illustrated London News. The language used to describe the site emphasised size, strangeness and uncertainty. The figures became giants. The desert became mysterious. Readers far from California could look at aerial photographs and wonder how such extensive designs had escaped wider notice. Newspapers understood the value of a good mystery then just as well as they do now. A giant person scratched into a remote American desert was more likely to attract attention than a careful discussion of gravel movement and cultural landscapes. The images were easy to reproduce, visually unusual, and accompanied by questions no one could answer with confidence. They offered exactly the sort of puzzle that encourages both serious investigation and enthusiastic nonsense. Some observers compared the human forms to giants or deities. Others wondered whether the animals were horses, mountain lions, or something else. Their age was uncertain. Their creators were not identified in written records. Aerial visibility led some people to imagine that the figures were intended as signals to the sky. The absence of an obvious explanation created open space, and speculation moved into it with the confidence of someone taking the last empty seat on a train. Yet the researchers working at the site faced ordinary practical difficulties. The United States was deep in the Great Depression. Museums and archaeological projects did not have unlimited funding. Reaching a remote desert site required vehicles, supplies, time, and cooperation. Aerial photography was valuable but not cheap. The initial excitement did not produce a permanent research station or a large team carefully examining every nearby terrace. The figures returned to relative quiet after the first investigations. They were known, photographed, and reported, but many questions remained untouched. The desert continued doing what it usually does, which is mostly sitting under a great deal of sunlight while making any metal object left outside reconsider its career choices. In 1933, National Park Service investigator Roger Toll visited the site while examining places that might deserve federal protection. Toll had played a role in evaluating potential additions to the national park system, including areas that would later become well-known protected landscapes. The giant figures were considered important enough to prompt discussion of preservation, and the lands containing them were affected by federal actions intended to prevent careless disposal. Still, the Blythe site did not become a national monument with staff, visitor facilities, and constant supervision. This early interest shows how quickly the aerial discovery changed the figures' status. Before the flight, they were features within a desert landscape known unevenly by different groups. Soon afterward, they were archaeological objects, newspaper subjects, a California historical landmark, and candidates for federal protection. Their physical condition had not suddenly changed, but the institution surrounding them had. Malcolm J. Rogers returned to the subject later in the 1930s. Rogers was an archaeologist known for his work in the deserts of Southern California and the wider Southwest. In 1939, he published scale sketches of most of the Blythe figures while discussing gravel pictographs throughout the lower Colorado River region and California deserts. His work helped place the famous group within a much larger pattern. This was important because the Blythe Intaglios were not alone. The aerial discovery may have made them seem like a single extraordinary accident, but researchers began identifying many other ground figures, alignments, cleared areas, circles, and geometric forms across the desert. Some were human, others represented animals or shapes that remained difficult to classify. The lower Colorado River contained a tradition of landscape marking far broader than one group north of Blythe. Once people knew what to look for, the desert became more crowded with evidence. A pale line no longer seemed automatically natural. Aircraft crews, archaeologists, surveyors, and local observers began reporting other possible figures. Some were genuine old geoglyphs, some were recent disturbances, others occupied an uncertain category, where the desert had not preserved enough information to make a confident decision. Aerial photographs were particularly useful because they allowed researchers to distinguish patterns across great distances. Human eyes are very good at finding shapes, sometimes a little too good. We see faces in clouds, animals in shadows, and occasionally a complete personal betrayal in the way someone places a teaspoon in the sink. A photograph does not eliminate this tendency, but measurements and repeated views can help determine whether lines form a consistent intentional design. The Army Air Corps photographs showed the Intaglios as they appeared on April 12, 1932. Later images taken in 1951 allowed researchers to identify changes over nearly 2 decades. One scholar who examined both sets noted that the earlier photographs showed the site largely free of the vandalism visible later. The figures had become a tourist attraction, and public curiosity had brought damage along with attention. This is one of archaeology's less cheerful patterns. Publicity can protect a place by making people care about it. It can also advertise the exact location of something fragile to every person who owns a vehicle, a pocket knife, or an unexplained desire to carve their initials into objects that survived perfectly well without them for centuries. The Blythe figures were especially vulnerable because their construction involved loose surface material. A person crossing a line could scatter stones. A vehicle could cut through an outline in seconds. New tracks could resemble old clearings, confusing the visual record. Even well-meaning visitors might step onto the figures for a photograph without realizing that the ground beneath them was the artifact. The first aerial images therefore became more than records of discovery. They became evidence of condition. They preserved arrangements that later observers could no longer see clearly. They allowed damaged sections to be distinguished from original ones and gave researchers a baseline from which to study the site. In 1952, the figures reached a much larger audience when Frank Setzler of the United States National Museum wrote about the desert giants for National Geographic. By then, 2 decades had passed since Palmer's view from the air. Aviation had become more familiar. The Second World War had filled the skies with aircraft and transformed large portions of the southwestern desert into training grounds. People were more accustomed to seeing the Earth from above, yet the Intaglios remained startling. Setzler's account presented the figures within a search for their purpose and identity. Like other researchers of the period, he tried to connect them with regional indigenous traditions, but early interpretations were often inconsistent and sometimes imposed stories from one community onto places associated with another. Scholars were learning that the figures belonged within native history while still struggling to understand which traditions, locations, and ceremonial practices were connected. The aerial view encouraged comparison with other large ground designs around the world. The Nazca lines in Peru eventually became the most familiar comparison, although the two traditions developed in different regions and cultural settings. Both demonstrated that people could create enormous designs by altering a desert surface. Both were preserved by dry conditions. Both looked impressive from aircraft. And both became magnets for claims that ancient human beings could not possibly have done something that ancient human beings had plainly done. The practical construction of the Blythe figures was never the impossible part. A group could clear stones and follow a planned outline using straightforward methods. The greater challenge for modern researchers was interpretation. An aerial photograph could reveal the position of every limb and curve, but it could not explain why the figure was made. Palmer's flight had solved one visual problem while creating a historical one. Once the shape became visible, everyone wanted to know what it meant. The photograph seemed complete, so people expected the explanation to be complete as well. Archaeology rarely behaves so generously. A photograph can tell us that a line existed by a certain date. It can show relationships between figures. It can record damage, orientation, scale, and construction. It cannot directly tell us whether people danced there, prayed there, taught stories there, mourned there, marked territory there, or combined several of those activities. The camera sees surfaces, meaning usually has to be reconstructed from many different forms of evidence, including oral traditions, associated features, archaeological context, and the knowledge of descendant communities. The first aerial view also changed how the figures were named. They became the Blythe Intaglios, because Blythe was the nearby modern town, and intaglio described their incised or cleared method of construction. Earlier publications often called them giant desert figures or gigantic intaglio pictographs. Each name highlighted something different. Giant emphasized scale. Desert emphasized setting. Pictograph suggested an image. Intaglio described technique. Blythe placed them on a modern map. None of those labels tells us what the creators called them. We do not know whether they regarded the forms as pictures in the ordinary sense, or as physical traces of beings, ceremonies, journeys, and events. Modern terminology is useful, but it can make an ancient place appear more neatly classified than it truly is. There is a quiet irony in the way the aerial view became central to the modern story. The figures had survived because they were made on dry, stable terraces away from regular flooding. Their enormous size helped preserve the overall design even when smaller details faded, yet that same size kept them from being easily recognised by outsiders on the ground. They were obvious and hidden at the same time. George Palmer did not need advanced scientific equipment to notice them. He needed height, attention, and the right angle. The aircraft provided a new relationship to the land. What had looked like scattered pale strips became a group of deliberate forms. Once photographed, those forms could travel far beyond the Colorado River. They appeared in museum files, newspapers, magazines, surveys, and eventually books, seen by people who would never stand on the desert terrace themselves. But every reproduction also removed the figures a little farther from their physical setting. On a page, they became isolated designs. The river disappeared. The mountains became background. The heat, wind, gravel, nearby trails, and cultural geography were reduced to the edges of a photograph. A reader saw a giant human and wondered who could view it from the sky. The people who made it may have understood it through an entire landscape. That difference would influence almost every later debate. Were the figures created mainly to be seen or to be used? Were the animal shapes companions, mythic beings, territorial signs, or participants in a larger scene? Did the spirals represent movement, ceremony, water, travel, or something else? Were all the features made at the same time? Had they been repaired by later generations? Did aerial photographs reveal their intended appearance, or only the perspective modern viewers found most convenient? Before those questions could be approached, researchers needed to examine the figures themselves more closely. From above, the forms looked simple: 3 human bodies, 4-legged animals, and curling lines arranged across dark gravel. On the ground, and in the early measured drawings, however, small details appeared. Some hands and feet had digits. Faint lines extended from heads. White boulders marked certain parts of the bodies. Pebble mounds stood within the figures. Limbs differed in shape and depth. The animals were familiar enough to recognize as creatures, but not clear enough to identify without argument. The first aerial view had revealed giants. The next task was to look carefully at their bodies, their companions, and the symbols placed around them, where every arm, tail, stone, and spiral might offer a clue or introduce another question. Seen from the air, the Blythe Intaglios do not appear as a single picture arranged neatly on one patch of desert. They are spread across 3 separate locations on gravel terraces above the Colorado River. Several thousand feet lie between the groups, enough distance that a person standing beside one figure would not automatically recognize the others as parts of the same site. The arrangement is closer to a collection of marked places than to one enormous mural. At each location, a human form lies across the ground. 2 locations also contain 4-legged animals, while curved and circular designs appear beside some of the figures. The entire area covers far more space than the familiar aerial photographs usually suggest. This matters because photographs often make the intaglios look pleasantly compact. A human figure, an animal, and a spiral may fit together on one page, creating the impression that they stand almost shoulder to shoulder. On the ground, however, the distances are much greater. The largest group occupies a higher terrace. Another lies on a lower surface roughly 3,000 feet away. The third is separated by another broad stretch of gravel. Anyone moving between them must leave one image behind, cross ordinary-looking desert, and then arrive at another. The empty spaces may have been just as important as the figures, especially if people approached them along particular trails or visited them in a set order. The human shapes are the first forms most viewers notice. They have rounded or oval heads, long bodies, arms extending away from the torso, and legs spread apart. Their proportions are not naturalistic. The bodies are narrow and stretched. The arms may appear unusually long. hands and feet are simplified, although 5 digits can still be seen in some early records. These are not portraits intended to capture a person's facial expression or the precise fold of a garment. At their scale, a small detail would disappear into the desert within a few steps. The makers selected the features needed to make a body recognizable from a distance, and left out almost everything else. The largest human figure lies in the group usually called Group A by archaeologists. It occupies a terrace approximately 75 feet above the surrounding floodplain. Early measurements placed it at about 167 feet long, while the Bureau of Land Management now gives the largest figure a length of 171 feet from head to toe. Measurements can vary slightly depending on which faint edges are included and how later disturbance has altered the outline, but either figure gives a useful sense of scale. A person lying beside it would look less like a companion and more like a forgotten pencil mark. The head of this large human points roughly toward the southeast. Faint lines extend outward from its sides and were interpreted by early researchers as strands of hair. Those marks are difficult to see from the ground, but aerial photographs taken under suitable lighting made them more visible. Their presence suggests that the makers were not satisfied with a plain circle for a head. They added features that may have represented a particular hairstyle, rays, ornaments, or some other detail whose meaning is no longer certain. Inside the head, early investigators recorded several pale boulders. Additional light-coloured stones were placed near the upper torso, in positions that researchers described as breasts. A mound of pebbles stood in the pubic region, rising several inches above the cleared ground. These additions gave the figure texture as well as outline. The image was not created solely by removing stones. In a few places, stones were deliberately placed, piled, or selected for their colour. This combination of clearing and building is easy to overlook in aerial photographs. From above, the figure may appear to be a pale drawing surrounded by dark gravel. At ground level, its edges were marked by ridges of displaced pebbles that could reach several inches in height. The makers scraped the darker stones away from the interior and pushed some of them toward the margins. The outline was therefore both negative and positive. A light area was opened in the surface while a low boundary rose around it. No individual ridge would look impressive beside a wall or monument. 4 inches of gravel is not likely to frighten an experienced builder. Across a body more than 160 feet long, however, those low ridges required a great deal of repeated work. Every section had to be cleared, defined, and connected to the next. The creators also had to preserve the intended proportions while standing too close to see the entire form. Beside the large human lies a 4-legged animal. It has a long body, a head, a tail, and limbs extending from the torso. Like the person, it is outlined by scraped-up gravel. A pale stone was once recorded in the head area, perhaps marking an eye. The animal is recognisably a creature, yet its exact species is difficult to determine. Its body is too simplified to provide the convenient checklist a modern zoologist might prefer. There are no carefully drawn claws, coat markings, teeth, or helpful little label saying mountain lion. Early researchers sometimes wondered whether the animals represented horses. That possibility carried an important implication. Horses disappeared from North America at the end of the last ice age and were reintroduced by Europeans beginning in the late 15th and 16th centuries. If the figures clearly depicted horses, they would likely belong to a relatively recent period. The difficulty is that they do not clearly depict horses. The same outlines have been compared with dogs, coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, and other 4-legged animals. A long body and 4 legs can start a discussion, but they cannot settle one. Current information from the Bureau of Land Management connects the animal figures with Hatakulia, described in Mojave and Quechan traditions as one of the mountain lion persons involved in creation. The human forms are associated with Mastamho, the creator of life. This interpretation places the figures within lower Colorado River traditions, rather than treating them as unidentified wildlife illustrations. It also suggests that the animal and human shapes may represent beings, whose importance cannot be understood by anatomy alone. A mythic mountain lion does not have to resemble a wildlife guide's perfectly labelled mountain lion. It may appear in a conventional form recognised by people who already know the story. Modern viewers sometimes expect ancient images to function like photographs. When a figure does not show enough detail, we assume it has failed to identify its subject. The original audience may not have needed those details. A few familiar features, the location of the image, and the ceremonies performed around it could have made the identity obvious. Near the large human and animal is a spiral. Unlike the two bodies, the spiral did not have the same raised gravel borders. It was formed mainly by clearing a curving path through the darker surface. The line winds inward, creating a shape that can be recognised from above but could also be followed on foot. Whether anyone actually walked along it is unknown, although the idea is difficult to avoid when a design resembles a route curling toward a centre. Spirals occur in rock art and ground designs across many regions, but that does not give them one universal meaning. A spiral can represent water in one setting, movement in another, a journey, a wind, a creature, a place, or something entirely different. It can also be a practical pattern used during ceremony without functioning as a picture of anything. Assigning a meaning based only on shape is tempting because the shape feels familiar. Unfortunately, familiarity is not evidence. A modern person may see a whirlpool, a galaxy, or the last stage of a badly rolled garden hose, while the makers may have understood it in a way none of those comparisons approaches. The second group lies on a lower terrace, and contains another human, another quadruped, and another spiral or circular feature recorded in early surveys. The human is smaller than the first, measuring a little under 93 feet from the head to the end of its longer leg, in one detailed mid-20th century report. Smaller is a relative term here. A 93-foot figure is still roughly the length of several large vehicles parked nose to tail, although arranging cars across an archaeological site would be a rather poor method of demonstrating this. Its head points approximately north. Faint lines again appear beside the head, suggesting hair or some form of extension. Where the fingers and toes remained visible, early researchers counted 5. A depression or hollow in the pubic area was interpreted by one investigator as indicating a female figure. Another human form contained a raised mound that was interpreted as male. These classifications have never been secure, and they reveal as much about the habits of early archaeology as they do about the intaglios. Researchers of the time often tried to assign gender by matching every mound, hollow, or stone with human anatomy. Yet the figures may not have been intended as ordinary male or female bodies. They could represent creator beings, ritual roles, transformed beings, or characters whose physical qualities do not fit modern categories. Damage further complicates the issue. A slight cavity may be ancient, or it may have been deepened by feet, erosion, animals, or later visitors. A pale boulder may be part of the original design, or it may have been added afterwards. The desert preserves much, but it does not attach dated certificates to individual pebbles. The second human overlaps a broad cleared circle. Early researchers concluded that the body had been placed over the circle because the human outline appeared to cross it. If that observation is correct, the site may preserve more than one phase of activity. The circle could have existed before the figure. The figure could have been added during a later ceremony or period of use. Alternatively, both might belong to one planned arrangement in which the overlap was intentional. The circle has sometimes been described as a dance ring. Its scale makes that possibility understandable. A broad cleared area could accommodate a gathering, and federal descriptions state that ceremonial dances were once held in the area to honour creation. Still, the exact relationship between the surviving circle and specific activities is not completely documented. Calling every open circle a dance ring can create an appealing picture, while moving more quickly than the evidence allows. It is safer to say that the cleared areas could have supported group movement, and that ceremonial use is consistent with indigenous accounts connected to the site. This second group suffered significant damage after the site became widely known. Visitors walked across the figures, disturbed the low ridges, and obscured parts of the outlines. One archaeologist writing in the 1950s described the damage with unusual directness, blaming what he called dull-witted sightseers. Academic writing is usually more restrained, so the condition of the site must have been particularly irritating. Trampling does more than make an ancient line less attractive. It removes information. A ridge that has been flattened can no longer reveal its original width or height. A modern footprint may scatter stones into a cleared area. Repeated walking can create a new path that looks older after years of weathering. Where several faint lines cross, it becomes difficult to decide which belong to the figure, which belong to earlier trails, and which were produced by someone searching for the best camera angle. The animal in the second group is smaller than the one beside the largest human. It shares the same basic method of construction and the same uncertain identity. Its placement beside a human figure may suggest a relationship between them, but the exact nature of that relationship is not shown through action. The animal is not obviously being hunted. It is not pulling a load, attacking, fleeing, or being ridden. The two forms simply occupy the same marked place. That stillness can be misleading. Ground figures are motionless by nature, but their use may have involved movement. People could have approached the human first and then turned toward the animal. They may have walked around both, stopped at particular points, placed objects, sung, danced, or recounted events associated with the beings. The action may have belonged to the visitors rather than to the image. The third group contains another enormous human figure, measured at approximately 105 feet long. Its head is oriented toward the southwest, giving it a different alignment from the other two. Lines thought to represent hair extend from the head. 5 digits were again recorded on the hands and feet, and a mound of pebbles occupied the pubic area. Low ridges marked the body's edges in the same manner found elsewhere at the site. The varying orientations are worth noticing. One human looks roughly southeast, another north, and another southwest. They do not all face sunrise, sunset, the river, or one obvious point in the sky. This does not rule out astronomical or directional meaning, but it makes a simple, single alignment less convincing. The position of each figure may instead relate to the shape of its terrace, the direction of an approach trail, the location of another sacred place, or an event associated with that particular ground. Near the third human, early surveyors recorded short crossed lines and several cleared circles. One archaeologist also reported a small and very faint animal resembling a bighorn sheep, roughly 17 feet from tail to nose. Later investigators could not confirm it in aerial photographs or on the ground. It may have faded, been misidentified, or never formed a deliberate animal at all. Archaeological records often contain features like this: something seen once, sketched, and then lost to damage or doubt. A disputed figure is not useless information. It reminds us that the site was never as clean and simple as the familiar diagrams imply. The desert surface contains countless marks. Some were made by people, some came from erosion, some are trails, vehicle scars, animal paths, or modern scratches. A few lines may belong to very old images that have almost disappeared. Separating them requires repeated observations, photographs from different dates, and a willingness to admit when a shape cannot be verified. Across all three groups, the human figures share enough features to suggest a common artistic tradition. Their bodies are elongated. Their arms and legs extend away from the torso. Hair-like lines appear near the heads. Hands and feet may carry 5 digits. Gravel ridges define the outlines, while mounds, hollows, and pale stones add selected internal details. The animals are similarly simplified, with long bodies, 4 legs, heads, and tails. The uniform style does not prove that all the figures were made on the same day or even by the same generation. A conventional design can survive for centuries. People learn how a sacred figure should look and reproduce it at different locations. Later groups may renew older forms while preserving their essential structure. What appears to modern viewers as one act of construction may be the visible result of repeated visits. The dark gravel helped the figures stand out when they were newly made. Desert pavement forms when wind and water gradually remove finer particles and leave pebbles concentrated on the surface. Many of those stones develop a dark coating known as desert varnish. Clearing them reveals lighter soil beneath. The contrast can remain visible for a very long time in dry conditions, but it gradually softens as dust settles, stones shift, and varnish develops on newly exposed surfaces. The creators may have returned to refresh the lines. If so, the current figures contain several ages at once. The original plan could be ancient, while portions of the visible surface were renewed much later. This possibility makes dating difficult, but it also changes how we imagine the site. Rather than one group carving an image and walking away forever, generations may have cared for it. Maintenance can be a ceremonial act. Reopening a faded line requires people to follow the old shape, remember where it turns, and decide which features matter. The act places new hands into the work of ancestors. A restored figure remains old, but it also becomes present again. Similar processes occur whenever communities repair sacred buildings, repaint ritual objects, or clear vegetation from important paths. Preservation is not always passive. Sometimes memory survives because people repeatedly remake its visible form. The large human shapes are often called anthropomorphs, a useful archaeological term meaning forms that resemble human beings. The animals are called zoomorphs, while spirals, circles, and crossed lines are usually grouped as geometric designs. These terms help researchers describe what is present without claiming to know exactly what each form represents. They are tidy labels for untidy questions. A human-like figure may represent a person, an ancestor, a creator, a spirit, a ritual participant, or a being whose identity combines several categories. An animal-like form may represent a mountain lion, another creature, a clan association, a helper in a creation account, or a role assumed during ceremony. A circle may mark a place of gathering rather than symbolizing an object. Description is the beginning of interpretation, not the end. The pale boulders are especially intriguing because they show the makers using contrast deliberately. A white stone placed against dark gravel and light-cleared soil would draw attention to a specific point. The stones recorded in the head of the large figure may have marked facial features or carried a separate ritual purpose. Those near the upper torso may have represented anatomy, ornaments, or later additions. Without knowing whether all the stones were placed at the same time, any confident explanation becomes fragile. The pebble mounds raise similar questions. Early writers treated them as anatomical markers, yet a mound can also be a place where offerings were deposited, where a post stood, or where material accumulated through repeated action. Their darkened upper surfaces indicate that they are not simply yesterday's piles, but their exact relationship to the first construction remains uncertain. The hair-like lines may provide one of the more culturally specific details. A mid-20th century researcher compared them with historical descriptions of long hair worn in multiple strands by Mojave and Quechan men. The comparison is interesting, although it cannot identify a creator on its own. Hairstyles change, artistic lines can have several meanings, and written ethnographic descriptions were recorded long after the figures may have been first made. Still, the similarity offers a reminder that apparently simple marks may carry details once easily recognized by local viewers. Another detail lies in the absence of certain things. There are no clear weapons in the main Blythe figures, no obvious buildings surround them, there is no written text. The people do not wear easily identifiable clothing, and the animals are not placed in scenes of hunting or herding. The images communicate through scale, location, posture, and association rather than through a crowded story. Their outstretched limbs give the human forms an open appearance. Modern viewers may read this posture as greeting, surrender, flight, worship. or simply the easiest way to show arms clearly. None of those impressions should be mistaken for proof. A pose that feels emotionally expressive today may have functioned as a standard way of representing a sacred body. The figures also change depending on the height and angle of the viewer. From directly above, the outlines seem clean and diagram-like. From a lower oblique angle, the bodies stretch across perspective and may appear distorted. From the ground, the ridge beside a leg can look like an ordinary line. This changing appearance may have been a part of the site's power. The figures are present even when they cannot be seen all at once. A person walking through the largest human could begin near the head, pass between pale stones, follow the long torso, and arrive at the mound near the lower body. Another route could trace an arm toward an open hand. The image would be learned in sections. Its complete form would exist through memory, instruction, and shared knowledge. That way of seeing is different from the instant aerial view. Modern observers want to step back until everything fits inside one frame. The makers may have valued the opposite experience, moving close, entering the design, and understanding it through participation. The giant figure did not necessarily need an audience in the sky. It may have needed people on the ground who knew what each line was for. The pairing of humans and animals strengthens that possibility. At two locations, the beings occupy the same ceremonial space. The spiral and circles introduce paths and enclosed areas. Trails connect the figures with the wider terrace. This site looks less like a set of isolated pictures when those surrounding features are included. It begins to resemble a landscape organized for movement, gathering, and memory. Even the spaces without drawings may have directed attention. A participant leaving one group had to cross a long stretch before reaching the next. That journey could create a pause between activities. The desert heat, changing light, distant river, and surrounding mountains would remain present throughout. No roof separated the figures from the environment. The entire setting participated in whatever occurred there. Modern fences now surround the best-known forms. They protect the fragile outlines, but change the experience. Visitors look through wire at images that may once have been walked, entered, and renewed. Preservation requires distance because the surface cannot endure unlimited feet. The result is a small contradiction. To save the figures as archaeological objects, people must avoid using the space in the way it may once have been used. Within the fences, the humans remain stretched across the terraces. The animals stand nearby. The spirals continue turning inward, although some lines have faded and others survive mainly in old photographs and drawings. Each form offers information, but none provides a translation. The shapes tell us that their makers understood scale, planning, contrast, and the behavior of desert surfaces. The repeated styles show that the figures were not accidental. Their associations with lower Colorado River creation traditions place them within a living, indigenous cultural world. Their circles, trails, mounds, stones, and paired beings suggest that they were more than decorations made for distant viewing. Yet the question of identity still waits beneath every outline. A figure representing Mastamho does not automatically tell us which community first made it, when the design was established, or how many generations returned to renew it. A mountain lion person drawn beside a creator does not explain who directed the workers or what words were spoken during construction. To move closer to those questions, we have to leave the completed shapes for a moment and imagine the people standing on the dark gravel before the first pale line had been cleared, deciding where an arm should begin and how far a giant body should extend across the desert. To understand how the Blythe Intaglios were made, it helps to forget the aerial photographs for a moment and return to the ground before any figure existed there. The terrace would have been covered by closely packed stones, most of them darkened on their exposed sides by desert varnish. Beneath that surface lay lighter sand and finer sediment. The difference in colour offered a ready-made drawing material. Instead of bringing paint into the desert, the makers used the desert's own layers, They moved the dark stones aside and allowed the pale ground underneath to become the image. The method sounds simple because it was simple. That does not mean the work was careless or easy. Making a line a few feet long requires a little planning. Making a human body more than 150 feet long requires people to agree where the head begins, where the shoulders widen, how far the arms extend, and where the legs separate. The workers had to preserve the shape while standing too close to see it as a whole. They could not step into a lift, rise above the terrace, and ask everyone to move the left foot slightly to the west. Early archaeological observations found that the figures were produced by removing the upper 2 or 3 inches of surface gravel, exposing the lighter, almost pebble-free material below. In the human and animal forms, much of the displaced gravel was pushed toward the edges, creating low ridges that outlined the heads, bodies, arms, legs, and tails. Some ridges reached about 4 inches in height. The spirals were made differently and generally lacked the same raised borders. The makers were therefore doing 2 things at once. They were clearing the interior and building the edge. A person could scrape stones outward with a wooden implement, a digging stick, a flat piece of material, or simply with hands and feet. Baskets may have helped move larger quantities, although no surviving tool has been securely connected with the original construction. The figures did not demand metal equipment. They required ordinary tools, many workers, or a smaller number of workers with considerable patience. Desert gravel is not as cooperative as loose beach sand. The stones vary in size. Some sit partly embedded in the ground, others are packed against their neighbours. Moving them repeatedly would be slow, particularly under strong sunlight. Anyone who has attempted to clear even a modest garden bed of stones will understand the basic problem. The desert version is much larger and includes no convenient wheelbarrow waiting beside the shed. The people probably began by choosing the right surface. The figures occupied dark gravel terraces where the contrast between varnished stones and the lighter material underneath is especially strong. A design placed on pale, loose soil would have been less visible and less stable. A design placed in an active wash could be erased by the first serious flood. The selected terraces stood above the Colorado River floodplain and were relatively protected from regular erosion, though nearby gullies still carried occasional flash floods. Choosing a terrace may have involved cultural reasons as well as practical ones. The builders were not simply searching for a good outdoor notice board. The places may already have been associated with creation stories, roots, ceremonies, or landmarks. The darkness of the gravel made the figures visible, but visibility alone does not explain why one particular terrace was selected while another was left untouched. Once the site was chosen, the design had to be transferred onto the ground. No surviving plan has been found, so any reconstruction must remain cautious. The makers may have started with a mental image shared through tradition. They may have drawn a smaller version in sand before enlarging it. They could have used stakes to mark important points such as the top of the head, ends of the hands, hips, knees, and feet. Cord or fibre rope could then have connected those points. Straight portions could be measured in footsteps, arm spans, or lengths of rope. Curves could be formed by laying a flexible line on the ground or by marking a series of points. None of these methods would have required a view from the air. Surveyors, builders, farmers, and artists have created large shapes throughout history using basic measurements. A person does not need to see an entire field from above to divide it into straight boundaries. A community does not need aircraft to align a long road, construct a large circular building, or arrange stones across an open plain. It needs shared units, reference points, and people capable of following instructions. The human body itself may have provided a system of proportion. The length of an arm can be related to the width of the shoulders. The distance from head to waist can guide the placement of the legs. If the makers used a smaller model, every measurement could be multiplied by a chosen amount. A hand 1 unit long in the model might become 10 paces on the terrace. The result would not need to match modern anatomical proportions. because the figures followed their own conventions. The similarities between the three human forms suggest that their makers followed a known style. Each has an elongated body, separated legs, outstretched arms, and lines near the head that have often been interpreted as hair. When hands and feet remained clear enough to examine, early researchers counted 5 digits. The animal forms were also constructed in a similar manner, with long bodies and raised gravel borders. One early study concluded that the stylistic uniformity suggested the human and animal figures may have been made during the same general period, though that cannot establish that they were all completed in a single event. A conventional style would make large-scale construction easier. If everyone involved already knew how such a being should be represented, they would not need to invent the image from the beginning. An experienced leader could indicate the main points, while others cleared the spaces between them. Younger participants might learn the design by helping older people. The work could serve as instruction as well as construction. The edges would require particular care. Early observers found that the gravel bordering the figures had been scraped into low ridges. Small stones must have been overturned during this process. Yet the exposed upper sides of many ridge stones later carried darker varnish than their undersides, resembling stones that had rested undisturbed for a long time. Researchers took this as evidence that the ridges were not recent, though desert varnish develops at variable rates and cannot provide a simple construction date by itself. The ridges may also have helped the figures remain visible. A cleared area naturally begins to change after construction. Wind carries dust across it. Rain moves small particles. Animals and people disturb the surface. Stones migrate inward from the edges. Studies of desert pavement show that cleared spaces can gradually fill and develop a new pavement, sometimes over periods relevant to archaeology. A border of displaced stones can influence that process, and the difference in varnish and stone size may allow an old clearing to remain visible even as it slowly heals. This means the figures we see today are not frozen exactly as they appeared when first made. Their pale interiors were probably brighter. Their edges were likely sharper. The gravel ridges may have been more regular. Fine features could have been clearer before centuries of dust, weather, feet, and vehicles softened them. The original builders may have expected this. People familiar with desert surfaces would know that a path fades if no one uses it, and that a cleared place changes when it's abandoned. They may have returned to the figures and refreshed the lines by removing newly arrived stones. If that happened, the construction was not one moment but a repeated process. Renewal creates difficulties for archaeologists because a figure can have more than one age. Its basic design may be old, while part of its surface was cleared again much later. One generation might repair a damaged arm. Another might deepen the torso. A later group could place stones on the head or add a mound. When researchers examine the visible figure, they may be looking at a collection of actions separated by decades or centuries. This is one reason the question of who made the intaglios cannot be answered with a single personal name. The first person who marked the design may not have been the last person who shaped it. The builders may have belonged to a community rather than a specialist class. A leader, ritual expert, or respected elder might have directed the work, but the physical labour could have been shared by many participants. We do not know how many people were involved. A large group could clear a figure quickly, with different teams working on the head, arms, body, and legs. A smaller group could complete the same task over a longer period. The removed stones did not have to travel far because many were pushed into the bordering ridges. The work would be tiring but technically straightforward. Imagine a line of people moving along the future edge of an arm. One person marks the boundary, others loosen the surface gravel and push it outward. Another group clears the centre. Someone checks the width from one side to the other. The process continues for dozens of feet. At intervals, the workers step back as far as the terrace allows and compare one section with another. Errors could be corrected. If an arm became too narrow, more stones could be removed. If a curve extended too far, gravel could be returned to part of the clearing. A ground drawing is easier to adjust than a carved block of stone. The desert was both the material and the eraser. The larger stones recorded inside some figures may have been placed after the main clearing was complete. Early accounts noted pale boulders in the head of the largest animal and in the head and chest area of the largest human. Researchers were uncertain whether all of these stones belonged to the original construction. Their light surfaces did not carry desert varnish, though similar stones elsewhere in the area also lacked varnish naturally. Pebble mounds were more clearly integrated into some of the human forms. A mound in the lower body of the largest figure reached about 7 inches high, while another in the third human reached roughly 5 inches. The stones on their exposed surfaces had developed varnish, suggesting that the piles had remained in place for a considerable period. Early researchers tried to interpret these mounds as anatomical features, though their precise meaning remains uncertain. Whatever their meaning, the mounds required a different action from the cleared lines. Material was gathered and placed rather than removed. The makers were using height, colour, texture and empty space together. From the ground, the low mound might have been more noticeable than it appears in an aerial photograph. A participant approaching the figure would see a physical feature rising from an otherwise flat body. The human figures may also have been compacted by walking. Repeated footsteps within a cleared area can press the fine soil down and discourage plant growth. Some circular areas near regional geoglyphs were described by early investigators as beaten or trampled surfaces resembling old trails. Whether the main Blythe bodies were deliberately stamped in this way is unclear, but construction and ceremony could both have produced compacted ground. If people danced, walked, or stood within the figures, their use would help maintain them. A path remains open because feet repeatedly remove new growth and shift loose material. The distinction between making a figure and using it may therefore be artificial. Movement could have been part of both. This raises an important point about the people responsible. Archaeologists often ask who built a monument as though construction were a separate technical project, completed before the meaningful activity began. At a ceremonial landscape, building may itself be ritual. Clearing the gravel could have been accompanied by songs, instructions, offerings, and retellings of creation events. Each movement of stone might have had a place within a larger performance. The work may also have involved rules about who could enter certain areas or handle particular features. Not every participant necessarily performed the same task. Some may have watched, others may have prepared food, carried water, supervised younger people, or maintained trails. The visible figure preserves only the final arrangement of stones. It does not preserve the social organisation around it. The identity of the builders has been debated since outsiders began studying the site. Early investigators used broad terms such as human to refer to several indigenous peoples whose languages belong to the human language family, and whose territories extended through parts of the lower Colorado River and surrounding deserts. Modern discussions more carefully recognize distinct communities, including the Mojave and Quechan peoples, each with its own history and traditions. The Bureau of Land Management states that Mojave and Quechan traditions identify the human forms as Mastamho, the creator of life, and the animals as Hatakulia, one of 2 mountain lion persons involved in creation. It also describes sacred ceremonial dances held in the area to honour creation. These traditions form the strongest cultural interpretation associated with the figures today. That does not mean archaeologists can confidently assign every movement of gravel to one modern tribal label. Communities along the lower Colorado River travelled, traded, intermarried, fought, relocated and shared certain ceremonial forms while preserving distinct identities. The figures may have been made during a period when territorial boundaries and community names did not match those recorded centuries later. Population movement further complicates the question. Epidemics, colonial expansion, warfare, missionization, military campaigns, forced displacement, river engineering, and economic change transformed the region. Oral histories survived these disruptions, but some knowledge was lost, restricted, or recorded by outsiders in incomplete ways. A person interviewed in the 19th or 20th century might know what a figure represented without claiming that their own immediate ancestors first constructed it. This distinction appeared even in early archaeological discussions. Researchers warned that a community's knowledge of a figure did not automatically prove that the same community had created it. People can inherit sacred places, adopt earlier images into living traditions, or continue ceremonies at sites made by related groups. At the same time, using this caution to dismiss indigenous knowledge would be equally mistaken. Archaeology cannot identify the makers by pretending that the region's living communities are unrelated to its past. The safest answer is that the figures were created within the indigenous cultural world of the lower Colorado River. Their methods, locations, subject matter, and associations fit a broader regional tradition of ground marking. The exact community, generation, and sequence of work remain uncertain. Mid-20th century researchers compared the Blythe figures with ground and sand paintings documented among indigenous peoples in the wider region. They noted that scraping, piling, anthropomorphic forms, animals, crosses, and serpentine designs all appeared in different ground art traditions. No historical account described a community making gravel figures at exactly the same scale and in exactly the same style as Blythe. But the basic technique was not foreign to the surrounding cultural world. This is significant because it removes the need to invent a lost population with extraordinary technology. The builders did not require advanced machines or aerial guidance. They belonged to societies that understood the desert intimately and used the ground as a medium for images, ceremonies, trails, clearings, and alignments. The enormous scale has often encouraged claims that the figures could not have been made without seeing them from above. Yet the same argument could be applied to many structures that were planned from ground level. Large earthworks, fields, roads, walls, and ceremonial enclosures have been built with basic surveying methods across the world. The human eye is not the only tool used in planning. Measurement allows people to create relationships too large to view at once. A central line could establish the body. Cross lines could mark shoulders and hips. Stakes could locate hands and feet. A cord tied to a fixed point could guide circles or curved heads. Teams could work between markers. The makers might also have used the surrounding terrain as a reference, aligning parts of the design with a mountain, river, sunrise point, trail, or another feature. These methods are possible reconstructions rather than confirmed facts, but none demands technology beyond what indigenous communities possessed. The work may have been completed surprisingly quickly. Moving surface gravel is labour-intensive, but it is far easier than excavating deeply into hard ground. The figures are broad clearings rather than trenches. The builders did not remove many feet of earth. They shifted a shallow layer and placed much of it beside the cleared area. A well-organised gathering could transform a large patch of terrace within days, though we have no reliable record of the actual time required. Speed, however, may not have been the goal. If construction formed part of ceremony, a slower process could have been preferred. Particular sections might be cleared in a defined order. Work could pause for songs or instruction. The builders may have returned seasonally rather than finishing everything at once. Water and food would have influenced the organisation. The terraces are dry, but the Colorado River lay nearby. Before modern dams and diversions, the river and its floodplain supported dense vegetation and important food plants, in contrast with the sparse scrub of the higher gravel surfaces. People could move between the productive river corridor and the ceremonial terraces above it. The setting was therefore not as isolated for the makers as it appears to a modern visitor arriving by road. The Intaglios stood near a major source of water, food, transportation, and settlement. Their location above the floodplain protected them while keeping them connected to the river world below. The dark terraces may have looked especially striking after seasonal floods. Water could spread across portions of the valley while the figures remained on higher ground. From the terrace, people would see green vegetation and river channels below, with dry mountains beyond. The images were part of this wider view, not marks placed in a blank emptiness. The contrast between river and desert may also have influenced their meaning. Creation traditions often connect beings with specific mountains, water sources, roots, and landforms. A human figure representing a creator would not be interchangeable with the same outline placed anywhere else. Its position could refer to what happened at that location or to a route taken through the landscape. The builders may have approached the terrace along established trails. Early surveys recorded trails, clearings, cairns, and other gravel features at Intaglio sites throughout the lower Colorado region. Some trails may have been ordinary travel routes. Others could have guided ceremonial movement. When a large figure is examined without these surrounding marks, part of its original structure disappears. A person arriving with the builders would not first see a complete human from the air. The experience would begin with movement across the land. The figure might gradually become recognizable through familiar signs. A cleared line could announce entry into an important area. A mound or circle might mark a stopping place. The body itself would be understood because the visitor already knew the story represented there. This may explain why the creators did not need a permanent viewing platform. The image was not a puzzle for strangers. It was built for people who knew what it was. They could picture the whole form while standing within one portion of it, much as a person can understand the layout of a familiar house while sitting in a single room. The aerial view is impressive because it gives outsiders instant recognition. For the original community, recognition may have come from knowledge rather than height. The figure was complete in memory before it was complete in sight. Later generations may have inherited both the image and the instructions needed to maintain it. A parent could show a child where the arm continued beneath scattered stones. An elder could explain why a mound belonged in one place and not another. Repairs would preserve more than the outline. They would preserve the act of teaching. When that chain of maintenance was interrupted, the desert began closing the figures. Gravel moved inward. Dust softened the contrast. Some lines became faint. Modern vehicles and visitors added new disturbances. Archaeologists then arrived and tried to reconstruct the design from the remaining surface, aerial photographs, and indigenous accounts. Their scientific methods could document dimensions, ridges, varnish, and orientation. Those details explain how the figures were physically made. They do not fully explain why particular beings were chosen, or why ceremonies took place at these spots. The hands that moved the stones remain unnamed, but they were not mysterious in the sense of being beyond ordinary human ability. They belonged to people who understood how dark gravel rested over pale earth, how terraces escaped the river's floods, how distances could be measured, and how a design could be carried in shared memory. Their technology was modest. Their planning was effective. Their reasons were strong enough to bring people together and reshape large sections of desert ground. The next clues lie not in imaginary machines or hidden aerial maps, but in the traditions connected with the being stretched across the terraces. The human forms have been associated with Mastamho, while the animals beside them have been linked with Hatakulia. To understand why a creator and a mountain lion person might be drawn at such an enormous scale, we need to listen more closely to the stories of the Colorado River peoples and to the landscape in which those stories take place. The enormous human forms at Blythe become less puzzling when we stop treating them as anonymous bodies and begin looking at the traditions connected to the lower Colorado River. According to the Bureau of Land Management, Mojave and Quechan accounts identify the human figures with Mastamho, a creator associated with life and the shaping of the world. The nearby animal forms are linked with Hatakulia, one of two mountain lion persons who took part in creation. Ceremonial dances were once held in the area to honour these events. This explanation does not answer every archaeological question, but it changes the starting point. The figures were not simply giant people scratched into an empty desert. They stood within a known landscape filled with places, routes, beings, and events remembered by communities along the river. To understand Mastamho, we must begin farther north, near a mountain rising above the desert landscape close to the Colorado River. Today it's commonly called Spirit Mountain, while the Mojave name is Avi Kwa Ame. In Mojave tradition, this is not merely an attractive mountain or a useful landmark. It is connected with the beginning of the people and the ordering of their world. The lower Colorado River, the surrounding mountains, the plants growing in the floodplain, and the knowledge needed for daily life are all understood through events associated with creation. A modern map separates Nevada, Arizona, and California with straight political borders. The older cultural map follows rivers, mountains, travel routes, and places where important events occurred. Accounts differ in details depending on the speaker, community, time of recording, and purpose for which the story is being told. That is normal for an oral tradition. A living account is not a printed instruction manual stored unchanged on a shelf. It is remembered, performed, taught, and connected to the people listening. Certain parts may be shared publicly, while others belong to particular ceremonies or knowledgeable individuals. Early outsiders often wrote down one version and treated it as the official story, rather like hearing one family member describe a wedding and assuming no one else at the table has anything to add. One account presented by the Fort Mojave Indian tribe begins in the first times, when earth and sky brought forth Matavilla. Before Matavilla could complete the work of teaching the people how to live, he was killed by Frog Woman. Responsibility then passed to Mastamho, described in this account as Matavilla's younger brother. At that time, the people did not yet understand hunger, thirst, cold, farming, shelter, or the differences between day and night. The world existed, but the knowledge required to live within it had not been fully organized. Mastamho drove a willow stick into the ground and drew out the water that became the Colorado River. With the river came fish and ducks. He used mud from the banks to form mountains on both sides of the water. He planted melon, corn, pumpkin, and beans in the overflow so that the people would have food. He taught them how to make fire when they were cold and how to build shade when the heat became too strong. Considering summer temperatures along the lower Colorado, the lesson about shade may have received particularly enthusiastic attention. He showed the people how to build houses and how to recognize day and night. He gave them fingers and taught them to count. He taught the 4 directions, the names of things, the use of plants, and the making of pottery for cooking and storage. Animals, insects, and birds entered the ordered world. The people received not one isolated skill but a complete way of living beside the river. According to the Fort Mojave tribe's account, Mastamho gave them the Colorado and everything along it, and they became the Ahama Kav, the people who live along the water. This helps explain why the river cannot be treated as background scenery to the Blythe Intaglios. It was the central source of food, fertile soil, travel, orientation, and identity. Before modern dams controlled its flow, the Colorado regularly overflowed into the surrounding lowlands. As floodwater withdrew, people planted crops in the moist ground. Farming depended on understanding the river's seasonal behavior rather than forcing water through an industrial system of pumps and concrete canals. The river also supplied fish and attracted birds and other animals. Mesquite grew in the region, providing beans that could be gathered and prepared. Clay from river sediments could be shaped into pottery. Willows and other plants offered materials for houses, tools, baskets, and shade structures. A person living there did not separate the river into categories such as economy, religion, transportation, and scenery. It supported all of them at once. Mastamho's actions therefore concern practical knowledge as much as creation. He does not simply form mountains and then disappear while everyone works out the difficult details. He teaches people how to eat, build, count, travel, grow crops, and recognize the organized features of their surroundings. The creation account describes why the world has its present form and how human beings learn to live responsibly within it. A giant image associated with Mastamho would carry more than the general idea of a powerful supernatural being. It could recall the origin of the river, the establishment of directions, the making of land, and the knowledge that allowed communities to survive. The human outline at Blythe may appear simple, but simplicity of shape does not mean simplicity of meaning. A national flag is also a fairly basic arrangement of colour and geometry, yet people rarely assume it was created because someone had spare fabric and an unusually quiet afternoon. The outstretched arms of the Intaglios may have been recognised through stories or ceremonial actions that are no longer fully available to outsiders. The figures could represent Mastamho during a particular moment, but no surviving public explanation securely identifies that moment. It would be tempting to say the arms are creating the land, protecting the people, indicating directions, or holding the river valley. Each idea sounds reasonable. None is proven by the posture alone. The same caution applies to the lines extending from the heads. Archaeologists have described them as hair, partly because historical Mojave and Quechan hairstyles sometimes included long strands. The interpretation is possible, but it does not by itself confirm the identity of the figures. Hair can mark a human being, a ceremonial role, or a conventional artistic style. The original viewers may have recognised the detail immediately, because they already knew what kind of person or being was shown. The animal figures beside two of the humans add another part of the creation account. Federal information identifies them with Hatakulia, one of two mountain lion persons who helped during creation. The wording is important. Hatakulia is not described simply as an ordinary mountain lion wandering across the desert in search of dinner. The figure belongs to a category in which a being can be understood as both mountain lion and person. Modern English often insists on choosing one label. Something is either a human or an animal, history or religion, a map or a song. Indigenous traditions do not always divide the world in those same ways. A mountain lion person may be an ancestor, participant, helper, or powerful being whose nature cannot be reduced to a wildlife species. The animal form on the terrace may therefore look anatomically vague, because anatomical precision was not its purpose. Early outsiders sometimes called the quadrupeds horses, dogs, mountain lions, or unidentified animals. Their bodies are long, their legs are simple, and no surviving detail settles the species through ordinary zoological comparison. Yet the cultural identification with Hatakulia offers something an anatomical debate cannot. It places the creature beside the human figure as part of an ordered creation landscape. The relationship between Mastamho and Hatakulia may also explain why the figures are grouped rather than randomly scattered. At two locations, a human and animal occupy the same broad ceremonial area. Their placement suggests association, although we cannot be certain whether each pair was made at the same time. If the figures were used during dances honouring creation, the space between them may have helped organise movement. People could approach one form, turn toward another, gather within a cleared area, or follow a route known through ceremony. The Bureau of Land Management's brief statement that sacred dances were held there offers only a small glimpse of what may once have taken place. A dance can preserve history without using a written page. Direction, posture, rhythm, repeated steps, songs, and the order in which people move can all carry knowledge. Participants learn where to stand, when to turn, and which words belong to each action. The ground becomes part of the performance. In that setting, the intaglio would not merely illustrate a story. It would provide the place where the story was remembered through physical activity. Walking beside a giant arm could be connected with one part of the account. Moving toward the animal might introduce another. A spiral could guide a sequence of steps. A cleared circle could hold dancers or observers. We cannot reconstruct the exact ceremony from the surviving gravel, but the possibility is more consistent with the evidence than the idea of an enormous picture created only for distant viewing. Mojave traditions also place exceptional importance on dreams. The Fort Mojave tribe describes dreams and visions as sources of knowledge through which a dreamer could return to the time of creation and witness the origins of things. Important dreams became great tellings and song cycles. They carried accounts of travel, conflict, healing, people and places. knowledge was not understood as something gathered only by observing the present. It could be received through direct experience of the creation period in dreams. These song cycles could be extremely long. In the 1960s, Mojave elder Emmett Van Fleet recorded a creation cycle containing hundreds of songs. The complete sequence recounted origins, journeys, sacred places, and directions for moving safely through the desert. The songs functioned partly as oral maps, preserving the order of landmarks and the routes connecting them. Decades later, those recordings helped demonstrate the Mojave people's continuing historical connection to threatened lands near Ward Valley. An oral map does not resemble a road atlas. It may describe a journey through songs performed in a particular order. Mountains, springs, valleys, animals, events, and beings appear as part of the route. Remembering the song means remembering the land. A person carrying that knowledge can travel through an environment that looks empty to someone who does not know its features. The Blythe figures may have worked in a similar way. They could have marked parts of a journey or events connected to a larger sequence. Their separation across several terraces supports the idea that movement between places mattered. The figures are not crowded together as though the makers were trying to save space. They require travel. A participant leaves one form, crosses open ground, and arrives at another. The creation story also places Avi-Kwa-Amy at the centre of a wider regional history. One National Park Service ethnographic account says Mastamho completed creation there and allotted lands to several peoples, including the Hualapai, Yavapai, Chemehuevi, Quechan, and Mojave. He taught human beings how to live in their respective territories and how to behave. The mountain therefore connects multiple communities within the lower Colorado region, even though their languages, identities, and particular accounts remain distinct. This distinction deserves care, because public descriptions sometimes combine Mojave and Quechan traditions as though they were one interchangeable story. The languages are related and the communities share parts of a regional creation landscape, but they are not the same people. Their accounts use different names, details, and emphasis. The Fort Yuma Quechan tribe refers to itself as Quatsan, commonly explained as those who descended. In its own current description of ancestral lands, the tribe connects its creation with Kukamat, Avi-Kwa-Ame, and movement into the lower Colorado River Valley. It identifies canyons, mountains, riverbanks, trails, prayer circles, sleeping circles, petroglyphs and geoglyphs as traces of a continuing ancestral relationship with the region. The use of Kukamat in Quechan tradition and Mastamho in Mojave accounts reminds us not to force all versions into one neat summary. Names may also appear in several spellings because indigenous words were written down by English and Spanish speakers using inconsistent systems. Mastamho may appear as Mustamo or in other forms. Avi-Kwa-Ame has also been written in several ways. Variation in spelling does not mean the tradition was confused. It often means the people recording it were attempting to represent sounds their own alphabets were not designed to handle. The same problem affects the word Mojave, often written Mojave in modern place names. The people refer to themselves as Ahamakav, though English spellings vary. Mojave Desert, Mojave National Preserve, and the city of Mojave use the spelling with a J, while the tribal name is commonly written with an H. One landscape can therefore contain several spellings produced by different histories, which is inconvenient for filing systems, but fairly normal for human language. Quechan oral history connects the ancestors with descent from Avi-Kwa-Ame and settlement in the lower river region. Current tribal materials emphasize that stories, songs, legends, and language lessons remain important ways of teaching honor, respect, responsibility, family roles, and traditional roots. The past is not presented as a vanished period belonging only to archaeologists. It continues through language education, cultural work, land protection, and the transmission of the knowledge between generations. This is why the Blythe Intaglios should not be described only as prehistoric curiosities. The exact dates and original builders remain uncertain, but the figures stand within living cultural landscapes claimed, protected, and explained by present-day indigenous nations. The people connected to them are not missing. Their communities still exist along the Colorado River, even after disease, military violence, reservation policies, boarding schools, land loss, and large engineering projects transformed the region. Those changes affected the stories as well as the land. The Colorado River was dammed, redirected, and divided through legal systems that often ignored indigenous relationships with it. Flood cycles that once supported farming were altered. Wetlands disappeared or changed. Settlements were moved. Children were sent to institutions that discouraged or punished the use of native languages. Ceremonial knowledge became harder to transmit when families were separated and access to sacred places was restricted. Under those conditions, asking why every detail of the Intaglios was not preserved in a written explanation misses the scale of the disruption. The surprising thing is not that some knowledge became uncertain. The surprising thing is how much survived through songs, oral histories, place names, language, and continued cultural practice. Archaeologists once approached sites like Blythe mainly by measuring the figures and interviewing local people for possible clues. Their reports sometimes treated oral accounts as one category of evidence, and the gravel itself as another, with the physical remains receiving greater authority. A modern approach must be more balanced. A ridge of stones can show how an image was constructed. It cannot tell us the name of the being shown there. Indigenous tradition can provide that identity, even when it does not supply the exact year in which the stones were moved. Neither form of knowledge answers every question. Archaeology can identify construction methods, compare photographs, study nearby trails, and estimate age. Oral tradition can explain how a place belongs within creation, ceremony, and community history. The strongest understanding comes from allowing those forms of evidence to work together without pretending they are identical. The Mastamho interpretation also changes the way we think about scale. If the figure represents a creator who shaped rivers, mountains, directions, and the conditions of human life, an image 171 feet long is not excessive. A small carving could represent the same being, but the broad terrace allowed people to place the figure directly within the land associated with his actions. The body extends across the desert because the story concerns the desert and river together. Hatakulia's large animal form may have carried a similar purpose. The mountain lion person is not displayed in a museum case, separated from the environment by glass and a small label. The being lies within the same ground, light, heat, and open space where the associated stories were remembered. The land is not the background of the image. It is the material from which the image was made. Visitors arriving today may find the figures difficult to see from ground level. That does not mean the original users were missing the intended view. They may have understood the forms through songs, dances, routes, and repeated visits. A person who knew the story did not need an aircraft to explain that a pale line formed part of Mastamho's arm. Knowledge completed what eyesight could not. The Intaglios may even have served as places where younger people learned the geography of creation. An elder could identify the human form, the animal beside it, and the direction toward another important place. A song could connect the terrace with a mountain or river crossing. Movement through the site would then become a lesson in land, memory, and responsibility. What outsiders call a giant drawing may therefore have been closer to a ceremonial ground, a place of instruction, and a physical part of a much larger oral map. The exact combination remains uncertain, but the connection with Mastamho and Hatakulia gives the figures a cultural setting that aerial photographs alone could never provide. Even with that setting, a difficult question remains. A living tradition can identify the beings and preserve the importance of the place without providing a construction date. The figures may have been created several centuries ago, or parts of them may be much older. They may have been renewed repeatedly, leaving ancient plans beneath the younger surfaces. The same ceremonies could continue long after the first workers had disappeared from living memory. Finding their age requires scientists to date an action that left no wooden beam, written inscription, or sealed foundation. The builders moved stones already thousands or millions of years old and exposed soil that was older still. Somewhere within the varnish, sediments, nearby hearths, and faint signs of repeated clearing lies a timeline, but the desert has not made it easy to read. Dating the Blythe Intaglios begins with a small archaeological inconvenience. The people who made them did not leave a wooden beam, a buried coin, a written dedication, or a neat little plaque saying that work began on a Tuesday and was completed after lunch. They moved stones that were already ancient, exposing soil that was also ancient, and they may have returned later to renew parts of the design. The action that created the figures was clear. The moment when that action occurred was not. Official descriptions commonly place the Intaglios somewhere between about 450 and 2,000 years old. That range is wide enough to contain many generations, major changes along the Colorado River, and a considerable number of people insisting that their estimate is the sensible one. Recent rock varnish research has narrowed the minimum age of sampled Blythe figures, suggesting that several are at least around 1,000 to 1,100 years old. Even that result does not give us the birthday of the entire site. It tells us that parts of the visible figures were already old enough for new desert coatings to begin forming on stones disturbed during their construction. The difficulty comes from the nature of a geoglyph. Radiocarbon dating works best when archaeologists find material that was once alive, such as charcoal, wood, seeds, bone, or plant fibre, and can show that it belongs directly to the event being studied. A fire built while a house was occupied may date that occupation. A wooden roof beam can help date construction. A piece of rope found sealed beneath a stone may date the moment the stone was placed. At Blythe, the builders mostly rearranged gravel. The dark stones on the surface had been lying there long before anyone moved them into ridges. The pale sand beneath them had formed long before the outline of a hand or foot was cleared. Dating either material by its geological age would tell us about the terrace, not about the people who shaped the figure. This is rather like trying to date the day someone rearranged the furniture by measuring the age of the oak tree from which the table was made. The table may be 100 years old. The room may be 200 years old. Neither tells you when somebody pushed the table closer to the window, because they wanted better light for a puzzle. Archaeologists therefore look for indirect clocks. Some are physical, some chemical, and some depend on relationships between features. A line that crosses another line is probably younger. A trail that disappears beneath a gravel ridge may be older than the ridge. An artifact trapped within material pushed aside during construction might have been present before the figure was made. A coating that formed after a stone was overturned may provide a minimum age for the disturbance. None of these clues behaves perfectly. Desert surfaces change slowly, but they do change. Wind carries dust. Rare rain moves fine sediment. Small animals burrow beneath stones. Plant roots disturb the soil. People walk across the figures. Vehicles cut through them. Later visitors move rocks without leaving a note explaining that they have just made the archaeologist's job slightly worse. The first investigators relied heavily on visual weathering. Michael Harner's detailed study from the early 1950s noted that the gravel ridges surrounding the human and animal forms were coated with desert varnish. More importantly, many stones had darker varnish on their current upper surfaces than on their lower surfaces, much like undisturbed stones elsewhere on the terrace. If some pebbles had been overturned while the ridges were created, their newly exposed sides must have remained facing upward long enough for varnish to accumulate and redistribute. That observation showed that the borders were not freshly scraped tourist constructions. It did not reveal exactly how many centuries had passed. Desert varnish is the dark brown, black or reddish coating found on exposed rocks in dry regions. It is extremely thin and develops through interactions involving windblown clay, manganese, iron, moisture, microorganisms, and changing environmental conditions. To the naked eye, it may look like a simple dark stain. Under powerful microscopes, it can contain very fine layers and differences in chemistry that record periods of formation. The trouble is that varnish does not grow at one reliable speed everywhere. A stone in a shaded microdepression may develop a coating differently from one exposed to direct sun and wind. Moisture, rock type, dust supply, surface angle, and local biology all matter. Two stones lying only a short distance apart can acquire different amounts of varnish over the same period. This made the early method of judging age by darkness unreliable as a precise clock. A very dark stone is usually not recent, but it cannot simply be assigned an age by comparing it with a colour chart. Desert varnish is not the archaeological equivalent of checking whether a banana has turned brown. Hahner understood this limitation. He used varnish mainly to argue that the figures had considerable age, while warning that the time needed for the coating to form depended on many variables. He also noted varnish on pottery from the wider lower Colorado River region, raising the possibility that the figures belonged to a pottery-using period. Yet regional ceramic chronology was still poorly understood, and pottery found near a figure does not automatically date the figure. This became another recurring problem. Early surveys found stone tools and flakes on the same terraces. Some belonged to very old archaeological traditions. A few objects were mixed into the gravel ridges outlining the figures. At first glance, that sounds helpful. If an ancient tool lies inside a ridge, perhaps the people who made the tool also made the figure? Not necessarily. The terrace had already contained artifacts before the stones were scraped aside. When the builders pushed surface gravel into a ridge, they could have gathered older objects lying among it. An ancient flake incorporated into a younger border proves that the flake was present before the border was formed. It does not prove that the two were made by the same people. Imagine cleaning an attic and sweeping an old coin into a pile of dust. The coin may be Victorian. The dust pile was made 5 minutes ago. An archaeologist discovering both together would need to resist the tempting conclusion that Queen Victoria had been doing a rather hurried bit of housekeeping. Associations become stronger when an object lies in a sealed context created during construction. Blythe offers very few such situations. The figures are open surfaces. Nothing was buried deeply beneath the foundation. Objects could arrive before, during, or after the clearing. Even a fragment found within an outline may have been dropped by a visitor centuries later. The animal forms once provided another proposed age clue. Some early investigators thought they might represent horses. Because horses were reintroduced to the region after European arrival, a clear horse image could place the figures in the historical period. If the animals were mountain lions, coyotes, wolves, dogs, or mythic beings, that argument disappeared. The outlines are too simple to settle the matter by anatomy. Their bodies have 4 legs, tails, and heads, but not enough surviving detail to identify bridles, hooves, saddles, paws, or coat patterns. Cultural accounts linking the animals with Hatakulia, a mountain lion person involved in creation, make the horse interpretation unnecessary. The historical date argument rested on a species identification that was never secure. The human figures also contain details that have been used in chronological arguments. Faint lines extending from their heads were compared with hairstyles, described among historic Mojave and Quechan people. Crossed marks and geometric patterns were sometimes treated as possible evidence of European influence, although similar designs occurred in indigenous pottery and art before sustained European contact. A cross is only useful for dating when its cultural meaning and context are clear. 2 intersecting lines can be created in many societies without knowledge of Christianity. Archaeology would be considerably easier if every shape belonged exclusively to one period, but circles, crosses, spirals, and stick-like people have the irritating habit of appearing in many places and times. By the late 20th century, researchers began attempting chemical dating of rock varnish. One approach involved accelerator mass spectrometry, which can measure very small amounts of radioactive carbon. Tiny organic materials can become trapped within weathering coatings. In theory, dating those materials may constrain when a new coating began forming after a rock surface was exposed. A 1995 study collected samples from lower Colorado River geoglyphs and reported a broad series of radiocarbon-related results, extending from roughly 900 years before the Common Era to around 1200 of the Common Era. These dates were widely repeated as though they directly established the construction period of the Blythe figures. The original researchers were more cautious. They described the work as experimental and warned that organic material trapped within a surface coating might not be exactly contemporary with the formation of the geoglyph. The problem is not that radioactive carbon stops working in the desert. The problem is determining what the measured carbon represents. Organic particles may be older than the varnish in which they became trapped. They may move through tiny openings. Different microscopic components within one sample may have different histories. A date produced by the laboratory can be technically accurate for the carbon, while remaining uncertain for the human action archaeologists actually want to date. This distinction is easy to lose when a clean number appears. A result such as 1,000 years can feel wonderfully definite. It has the satisfying confidence of a digital clock. Archaeological dates are often closer to a timetable printed during ongoing railway repairs. They remain useful, but it is wise to leave a little room around the edges. Another method, called Cation ratio dating, examines changes in the chemistry of rock varnish. Certain mobile elements are gradually removed from the coating more rapidly than less mobile ones. By measuring the ratios and comparing them with regionally calibrated surfaces, researchers can estimate how long varnish has been developing. Cation ratio dating played an important role in early attempts to obtain numerical ages for rock art and desert features. It also became controversial because varnish chemistry can be altered by local environmental conditions, and because some initial assumptions proved too simple. Later researchers treated the method as most useful when combined with other evidence rather than as a perfect independent clock. The results recently applied to sampled Blythe features produced minimum estimates of about 1,000 years for one human figure and around 1,100 years for another human and the quadruped. The uncertainties around those values are several centuries wide. The agreement between them is still interesting because it suggests that those particular forms may have been constructed within the same general period and could have been parts of a planned arrangement. It does not prove that every line, circle, mound, stone and spiral was created at once. A newer approach known as varnish microlamination dating studies the tiny sequence of dark and light layers inside the coating. Some dark manganese-rich layers are associated with wetter climatic periods, while lighter orange or yellow layers formed under drier conditions. Researchers compare these microscopic sequences with a regional chronology built from independently dated geological events. The method is not like counting annual tree rings. One varnish band does not equal 1 year. The layers mark broader environmental episodes, some separated by centuries. They are useful for placing a surface within a general period, not for identifying a particular afternoon when someone pushed the first pebble aside. There is another delay built into the process. When a stone is overturned or lifted into a newly formed ridge, varnish may not begin developing immediately across its entire surface. Microscopic patches can start forming within a few decades, while other areas remain bare much longer. Studies of known disturbances have shown that different tiny depressions on the same exposed surface can produce different minimum ages. Researchers therefore sample several microbasins and usually give the greatest weight to the oldest surviving varnish sequence. The oldest sequence probably began closest to the time when the stone was first exposed. Younger sequences may reflect delayed formation, later cleaning, erosion, or renewed disturbance. Even the oldest coating began after the human action, making the result a minimum age rather than an absolute construction date. The term minimum age is essential. If varnish on an upturned stone began forming 1,000 years ago, the figure must be at least that old. It could be somewhat older because time passed between construction, pavement regeneration, movement of smaller stones, and the start of measurable coating. The method tells archaeologists that the feature cannot reasonably be younger than the oldest post-disturbance varnish. It does not show how much older it might be. These dates are often expressed as calendar years before present. In archaeological convention, present means 1950, not the year in which you happen to be listening. This can sound slightly stubborn, as though archaeology chose a favourite year and refused to move on, but using a fixed baseline prevents the meaning of every published date from changing annually. A result of 1,000 calendar years before, present therefore points roughly to the middle of the 10th century. 1,100 years before present falls roughly in the middle of the 9th century. Because the estimates have wide margins and represent minimum ages, it is safer to say that the sampled Blythe figures are at least about a millennium old, rather than assigning them to one ruler, drought, ceremony, or exact decade. The current federal estimate of roughly 450 to 2,000 years reflects the broader uncertainty surrounding the full group. Some features may be younger than others, some may have been refreshed, certain stones may have been added later. The first construction could predate the latest visible clearing. A site used for repeated ceremony does not have to possess one single age. This becomes clearer when we look beyond Blythe. Recent varnish work on geoglyphs elsewhere along the lower Colorado River produced a much wider span of minimum dates. Some figures appear to be several hundred years old, others may be thousands of years old. At one location, separate human and snake-like designs seem to have been added during different periods across a very long history of ritual use. The regional tradition was not one short burst of desert drawing. It appears to have continued, changed, and expanded over time. The Blythe figures may represent one concentrated phase within that longer tradition. Their similar styles, closely matching minimum ages, and paired human and animal forms support the possibility that at least some were planned together. Yet the surrounding circles, spirals, trails, and smaller marks may belong to different visits. Maintenance complicates the surface record further. Suppose a figure was first cleared 1,200 years ago and refreshed 600 years ago. Workers returning to the site might remove stones that had migrated into the pale interior. They could disturb young varnish, expose fresh surfaces, and rebuild a ridge. Samples taken from the renewed area might produce a younger minimum age than samples from a section left untouched. The figure would be both 1,200 and 600 years old, depending on which event was being measured. That is not a contradiction. A medieval building with a modern roof has several valid dates. The difficulty comes when the ancient structure is made from loose gravel, and the renovations are performed with exactly the same material and technique as the original work. Repeated use may also explain why some lines are deeper or clearer than others. The central bodies of many regional human figures are more strongly cleared than their limbs. This could reflect construction choices, repeated movement through the torso, deliberate renewal of particular features, or unequal preservation. A faint hand does not necessarily mean it was added later. It may simply have received less maintenance or suffered more damage. What survived at Blythe is therefore a mixture of original design, natural change, ceremonial renewal, and modern interference. The broad bodies remain visible. Low gravel ridges still outline limbs and animals. Hair-like lines survive faintly near some heads. Pebble mounds rise within the human figures. Pale stones mark selected positions. Cleared circles and spirals can still be traced, though some are clearer in early photographs than on the ground today. The photographs taken by the Army Air Corps in 1932 are among the most valuable surviving records. They captured the site before it became a well-known attraction. When Hane compared those images with photographs from 1951, he could identify later defacement and separate some modern disturbances from older features. Details that had become difficult to see on the ground remained visible in the earlier vertical views. Those photographs preserve evidence that the desert itself could not keep safe. They show line positions, circles, ridge boundaries, and subtle variations in colour before decades of visiting vehicles and feet altered them. An aerial image does not date construction, but it establishes that a feature existed by the day the photograph was taken. It also records condition, allowing later researchers to measure loss. Damage accelerated after the figures received national publicity. Visitors crossed the outlines, scattered gravel, created paths and drove vehicles nearby. Some marks were intentional vandalism, others came from curiosity and poor judgment, a combination that has had a surprisingly long career at archaeological sites. Off-road tracks are particularly destructive because they cut deeply through the surface and produce pale lines much like the Intaglios themselves. From the air, a modern vehicle scar can remain visible for decades. Researchers must distinguish these tracks from ancient clearings by using dated photographs, patterns of weathering, road history, and chemical tests. Fences were eventually built around the major figures, reducing direct traffic. Protection came at a cost to the original ground-level experience, but without it the outlines would have continued to disappear beneath new paths. The site's listing in federal and state records also acknowledged that its value lay not only in what was already known, but in the information the ground might still contain. Environmental survival has been unusually good because the figures sit on stable terraces above the active river floodplain. Hana described the surfaces as almost free from erosion, though washes and gullies cut nearby areas during rare flash floods. Sparse vegetation also helped. Roots did not repeatedly break the outlines, and there was no thick growth to hide or churn the surface. Dryness preserves, but it does not stop time. Dust gradually reduces the contrast between cleared interiors and dark pavement. Stones shift inward. Varnish forms on newly exposed surfaces. Rare rain can move sediment more dramatically than years of ordinary weather. The figures survive because change is slow, not because it is absent. The cultural evidence survived differently. Mojave and Quechan accounts identify the beings and connect the site with creation and ceremonial dancing. Oral tradition cannot provide a laboratory date, but it preserves the reason these forms belong in this landscape. Early ethnographic records from other lower Colorado River sites also describe gravel features associated with Mastamho and creation events, showing that the connection was not invented after the Blythe figures became famous. The survival of these accounts is especially important because many physical actions leave almost no archaeological trace. Songs do not fossilize in gravel. The order of a dance cannot be recovered by measuring a ridge. The words spoken to younger participants do not remain beneath the sand. Once ceremonial practice is interrupted, the surface alone cannot recreate it. Dating can tell us that sampled figures are at least around 1,000 years old. Regional evidence suggests that the wider geoglyph tradition lasted far longer and changed over time. Early photographs show what the figures looked like before much modern damage. Varnish reveals that disturbed stones remained exposed through many centuries. Oral histories identify Mastamho and Hatakulia and preserve the site's relationship to creation. Together, these clues bring the Intaglios closer to history, but they do not reduce them to one event. Their age may be layered. The first clearing, later renewal, repeated ceremony, abandonment, rediscovery, damage and protection all belong to the surface we see now. 1,000 years ago, people already knew these terraces. They knew where the human bodies lay, which animals stood beside them, and how the marked places fitted into routes along the Colorado River. The figures were not mysterious to those who used them. Their uncertainty belongs largely to us. Knowing that they are old does not tell us why their builders made them so enormous, why the forms were separated across several locations, or why spirals and cleared circles accompanied them. The next question is no longer simply when stones were moved. It is what people came there to do. The site may have marked ceremony, territory, pilgrimage, remembered events, or several purposes at once, while its visibility from the air continues to invite the most persistent possibility of all, that the figures were intended as messages to something watching from the sky. The moment we ask what the Blythe Intaglios were for, the desert becomes far less cooperative. Their construction can be explained with ordinary tools, careful measurement and shared labour. Their age can be approached through varnish, weathering, early photographs, and the few traces that survived around them, purpose is harder. A cleared line does not preserve the song sung beside it. A spiral does not explain whether people walked through it, danced around it, or simply recognized it as part of a story. The figures remain visible, but the actions that gave them meaning have left only partial clues. The strongest interpretation begins with ceremony. The Bureau of Land Management states that the human forms represent Mastamho, and the animal forms Hatakulia in Mojave and Quechan traditions, and that sacred dances were held in the area to honour creation. Archaeological studies of Lower Colorado River geoglyphs have also documented cleared circles, trails, rock piles, and open spaces associated with many figure sites. Those surrounding features make the Intaglios look less like isolated pictures and more like places arranged for people to move, gather, stop, and perform. Imagine approaching one of the terraces before fences, roads, and viewing signs appeared. You would not see the entire human form at once. You might first encounter a trail crossing the dark pavement. Farther on, a cleared circle would open beside it. A pale line might lead toward the head or arm of a much larger body. Someone who knew the place could tell you where to stand, which direction to face, and what event was associated with that section of ground. The meaning would arrive through instruction and movement rather than through one perfect overhead view. This is an important difference. Modern visitors often behave like viewers in a gallery. We want to stand in the correct spot, look at the whole object, and understand what it depicts. A ceremonial landscape may not be designed for passive viewing. It may be designed to be entered. Its significance can unfold through a route, a sequence of stops, songs, purification, dancing, and the retelling of events tied to each location. Ethnographic work with Quechan and Mojave consultants has connected Lower Colorado River Intaglio sites with a creation route often written as Zamquachan. In these accounts, the route follows the journey of Mastamho, another spelling of Mastamho southward from Aviqua Ame, or Spirit Mountain, toward the land of the dead. Groups led by ritual specialists stopped at places associated with creation events for singing, dancing, and ceremonial purification. The intaglios, trails, circles, and cairns marked portions of this much larger sacred geography. Seen this way, Blythe was not a single destination standing alone in the desert. It belonged to a chain of places extending along the Colorado River and across nearby valleys and mountains. The journey between sites mattered because the creation story itself involved movement through the landscape. Travelling the route allowed participants to follow the actions of the creator, not symbolically in a distant theatre, but at the locations where those events were understood to have happened. The word pilgrimage is useful here, though it must be handled carefully. It can make us imagine a long line of travellers carrying bags, walking toward one famous shrine, and wondering whether the person in front has brought enough water. The Lower Colorado River pattern may have been more varied. Different communities could use different sections of the route. Some journeys may have been undertaken by ritual specialists, while others involved larger groups. The same site could be visited for creation ceremonies, mourning rituals, instruction, purification, or events whose details were not recorded by outsiders. A pilgrimage route also explains why the figures occur at separated locations rather than in one compact arrangement. A sequence needs distance. Leaving one marked terrace and crossing ordinary-looking ground before reaching the next creates a transition. The traveller moves from one episode to another. The river, mountains, heat, and open sky remain present throughout, turning the entire journey into part of the ceremony. At the figures themselves, cleared circles may have served as dance areas. Trails could direct entry and departure. Rock cairns might mark particular points, or hold materials used during ritual. The human and animal forms could identify the mythic beings connected to the place. None of these functions excludes the others. A circle can be a performance area and a symbol. A trail can guide practical movement and repeat a sacred journey. A giant body can be an image, a location, and a participant in ceremony at the same time. Researchers have also proposed a connection with the Keruk, a mourning ceremony found in different forms among human-speaking peoples of the lower Colorado region and beyond. Archaeologists Jeffrey Altschul and Joseph Ezzo argued that major geoglyph centers may have formed part of a ceremonial trail used during a period when warfare and population movement shaped life along the river. In their model, ritual could bring together related communities even when political relationships were tense, allowing recognized spiritual leaders or protected pilgrims to pass through contested areas. Mourning ceremonies are not merely private expressions of grief. They can renew social ties, redistribute goods, remember the dead, recount origins, and reaffirm relationships between living communities. If geoglyph sites were used in such ceremonies, the enormous figures may have linked individual loss with the much older story of creation. The dead were placed within a world already shaped by Mastamho, and the route toward the land of the dead repeated a journey established in the beginning. This interpretation does not mean that every Blythe figure was built specifically for one mourning ceremony. Archaeologists themselves have warned that the geoglyph tradition appears broader and older than any single documented ritual form. Ceremonies change over time. A site created for one purpose can acquire additional meanings. A creation place can later become part of mourning, pilgrimage, political gathering, or teaching without losing its earlier importance. The next possibility is territory. Giant figures placed on high gravel terraces could announce that a particular stretch of land belonged within the history of a particular people. The beings shown were not random decorations. A creator figure understood throughout the river region could connect the ground with a shared cosmology, while differences in style might identify the community responsible for maintaining that location. Altschul and Ezzo noted that geoglyph centers at Pilot Knob, Ripley, Blythe and Tupac differ in scale and design. They considered whether these local styles functioned as markers of ethnicity and territory among culturally related groups who shared important beliefs, but sometimes competed or fought with one another. In this model, the basic image was widely understood, while its particular form said something about who used the land around it. A territorial marker does not have to behave like a modern fence, or a sign reading private property. It can mark belonging through history. Placing Mastamho within a landscape could say that this place is part of the world our traditions describe, that our ceremonies occur here, and that our ancestors know the route. The claim would be social, spiritual and political at once. The figure's size would help in that role, but not because strangers could read them easily from the air. A large ceremonial ground requires effort to create and maintain. That labour demonstrates attachment. Returning to clear the lines, hold dances, and teach the associated stories repeatedly establishes a community's relationship with the place. Territory is not only declared once, it is renewed through use. Yet the territorial explanation has limits. The same scholars who explored it warned that reducing each geoglyph style to one group's boundary marker may be too simple. The river communities shared a broad cosmological system, exchanged ideas, intermarried, migrated, took captives, and sometimes adopted practices from one another. Warfare could separate groups, but it could also spread songs, rituals, and images. A figure might express local identity while still belonging to a regional religious tradition. This gives the Intaglios a role not unlike regional dialects. The basic language is shared, but pronunciation and vocabulary reveal where a speaker comes from. The figures at Blythe may depict beings recognised far along the river, while expressing those beings in a style associated with the people who cared for that stretch of land. No helpful accent mark was carved beside them, unfortunately. So archaeologists must work with scale, shape, location, and comparison. Ceremony, pilgrimage, and territory therefore fit together better than they compete. A community could travel to an important place, perform a ceremony, maintain the figure, and reaffirm its connection with the land during the same event. Modern categories separate religion, geography, politics, and art because separate departments need labels for their filing cabinets. The people who created the intaglios may not have divided their activities in the same way. There is also the possibility that the figures served as teaching grounds. A giant body offers space for many people to gather around it. An elder or ritual specialist could identify the creator, point toward the associated animal, describe the direction of the journey, and lead participants through a sequence of actions. Children and younger adults would learn the design by walking it and helping maintain it. Teaching through movement can be highly effective. A route learned with the body is often remembered differently from information heard once. Anyone who has confidently remembered the location of a room while completely forgetting the instructions given inside it has encountered this difference. At Blythe, the position of a circle, the turn of a trail, and the distance between figures could anchor parts of a story and physical experience. The open setting may also have connected ceremony with the surrounding horizon. Mountains visible from the terraces could identify other important places. The river valley below provided direction and context. Sunrise, sunset, stars, seasonal weather, and the changing position of shadows would naturally affect any event held outdoors. This has encouraged astronomical interpretations, but the evidence for a simple observatory or calendar remains weak. The three major human figures do not all share one orientation. Their heads point in different directions, and the accompanying animals and spirals do not form one obvious repeated alignment toward a single sunrise, sunset, or star. Individual lines may correspond with features on the horizon, but in a landscape filled with mountains and celestial events, some apparent alignments will occur by chance. Demonstrating intentional astronomy requires a consistent pattern, not one exciting line drawn through a photograph after the fact. That does not mean the sky was irrelevant. People living beside the river knew the seasons, the daily movement of the sun and the night sky. Ceremonies may have been timed by environmental and celestial cycles. The open-air figures existed beneath the sky at every moment. What the evidence does not show is that they were built primarily as astronomical instruments or coded star maps. Then we arrive at the idea that has followed the Blythe Intaglios since aircraft first revealed their full shapes. Perhaps the figures were messages intended to be seen from above. The logic seems immediate. They are enormous. Their complete forms are easiest to recognize from the air. Ancient people had no aircraft. Therefore, the intended audience must have been beings capable of looking down from the sky. It is a wonderfully dramatic argument, and almost entirely dependent on a modern assumption. It assumes that an image must be viewed as a complete picture from one position. It also assumes that if the makers could not personally occupy that position, they would have no reason to create the image. Neither assumption is necessary. People regularly make things they cannot see all at once. A procession follows a route too long for any participant to view in full. Builders lay out walls whose complete plan is visible only on paper or in memory. Farmers divide large fields. Communities create earthworks, roads, gardens, and ceremonial enclosures understood through measurement and repeated use. The Blythe figures could be planned from the ground, and their purpose could depend on walking and ceremony rather than overhead viewing. There is no archaeological evidence at Blythe for aircraft, advanced surveying machines, visitors from another world, or a civilization hovering politely above the Colorado River, waiting for someone to finish clearing the left arm. The construction method is entirely consistent with human labour using simple tools. The cultural traditions associated with the site identify creator beings and ceremonial use without requiring extraterrestrial assistance. Supporters of the sky message idea sometimes argue that the figures may have been offerings or signals to gods rather than aliens. That is more difficult to dismiss because many religious traditions create objects for supernatural audiences. A roof decoration may be made for beings above. A buried offering may be placed where no living person will see it again. A prayer can be spoken without expecting a human reply. It is therefore possible that spiritual beings formed part of the intended audience. The figures represent beings tied to creation. and the open sky may have mattered within ceremony, but possible is not the same as demonstrated. No surviving account says the Blythe figures were designed because Mastamho had a culia, or another being needed to see their outlines from overhead. The strongest available accounts describe the sites as locations of mythic events, ritual movement, dancing, and pilgrimage on the ground. The phrase "best viewed from the air," used in modern visitor information, can quietly create confusion. Best viewed does not mean originally intended to be viewed. A cathedral may be best photographed by a drone, but that tells us little about why medieval worshippers entered through its doors. A large garden is easiest to understand from above, even though it was built for people walking along its paths. Aircraft gave modern observers a new way to appreciate the intaglios. They did not necessarily reveal the maker's preferred viewpoint. In fact, the aerial perspective removes much of what may have mattered most. From above, the heat cannot be felt. The gravel does not shift beneath the feet. The distance between figures becomes compressed. Trails look like lines rather than journeys. Circles become shapes rather than spaces filled with bodies, sound, and movement. The aerial image is excellent for measurement and very poor at preserving experience. It shows the body while hiding the ceremony. There may also have been no single intended audience. The figures could address participants, ancestors, spiritual beings, neighbouring communities, future generations, and the land itself. Human objects often carry several messages at once. A memorial is built for the dead, the living, visitors, descendants, and the society that pays for it. Asking who it is for can produce several correct answers. At Blythe, a person taking part in a dance might understand the figure differently from a traveller passing through. A ritual specialist could know details not shared publicly. A neighbouring group might recognise the creator, but identify the style as local to another community. A child might first encounter the place as a lesson, and later return with ceremonial responsibilities. Meaning changes with position, knowledge, and time. The intaglios themselves may have changed function across generations. An early figure could mark a creation event. Later, people might incorporate it into a mourning route. Periods of conflict could strengthen its territorial importance. After disruption and population movement, the site might become a place of memory rather than regular ceremony. Once outsiders publicised it, it acquired still more roles as an archaeological site, tourist destination, protected landmark, and object of speculation. Each new use leaves traces. Ancient visitors renewed lines and perhaps added features. Modern visitors created tire marks and footprints. Archaeologists installed markers and fences. Government agencies placed signs. Pilots and photographers transformed the site into an image circulated around the world. The landscape now carries ceremonial history and the history of attempts to explain it. Of all the interpretations, ceremony and creation remain the most strongly supported because they are connected with indigenous accounts and with the physical arrangement of trails, cleared circles, and figures. Pilgrimage offers a way to understand the wider chain of sites along the river. Territorial identity may explain local stylistic differences and the importance of maintaining particular centres. Teaching, mourning, and social gathering fit naturally within those larger activities. The sky message theory survives mainly because the aerial photographs are so powerful. They give us the satisfying sensation of seeing something ancient people supposedly could not see. But the contradiction is created by our own way of looking. The makers did not need to hover above the figures because they were not strangers trying to recognise them for the first time. They knew what they were making, where each line belonged, and why the place mattered. That may be the most useful shift in perspective. Instead of asking how people on the ground could create an image for the sky, we can ask how a community used the ground to preserve a story. The pale lines then become routes through memory. The giant body becomes a place where creation was recalled. The animal becomes a companion within that account. The spaces between the figures become stages of a journey rather than empty gaps. Even this interpretation leaves many details unresolved. We still do not know which ceremonies took place at each of the 3 Blythe locations, whether all the figures were used together, how often they were renewed, who was allowed to enter them, or whether the spirals guided actual movement. We cannot tell whether one gathering involved a few specialists or an entire community. We do not know which songs belong there or what a participant would have been told while standing beside the largest human form. Those missing details are not small. They are the difference between identifying a ceremonial landscape and understanding a ceremony. Archaeology can recognize the stage after the performers have gone. It can measure the floor, map the entrances, and notice where people repeatedly stood. The performance itself survives only where living memory, recorded testimony, and careful inference allow part of it to return. The Blythe Intaglios therefore sit between explanation and uncertainty. They are not inexplicable objects left by unknown powers. Their construction, cultural setting, and broad ceremonial significance can be understood. At the same time, the figures refuse to become a complete translated document. Every strong answer leads to a narrower question, and every narrow question returns us to a line of stones that has outlived the voices once gathered around it. The next step is not to invent an answer large enough to fill every silence. It is to look carefully at what the figures still reveal, what later damage has removed, and what may remain deliberately beyond the reach of outsiders. Across the terraces, Mastamho and Hatakulia continue to hold their places, while the desert keeps the last pieces of their story in forms that can be measured, walked around, and photographed, but never quite made to speak on command. The Blythe Intaglios still lie across the gravel terraces north of the Colorado River, surrounded by fences, desert roads, low vegetation, and the long shadows of passing clouds. Their outlines can be photographed, measured, mapped, and compared with the aerial images taken nearly a century ago. Researchers can identify the stones moved by human hands and the lighter soil exposed beneath them. They can record the length of a body, the position of an animal, and the direction in which a head faces. Yet the most important questions remain just beyond the reach of those measurements. We still do not know the names of the people who first stood on these terraces and decided where the figures should be placed. We do not know whether one experienced designer directed the work or whether the plans were agreed upon by a large ceremonial group. No record tells us how many people cleared the gravel, how long the work took, or what words were spoken while the lines were formed. The builders left an enormous result, but none of the ordinary details that usually accompany construction survived. The broad cultural setting is much clearer. The figures belong to the indigenous history of the lower Colorado River, and Mojave and Quechan traditions connect the human forms with Mastamho and the animal forms with Hatakulia. Official descriptions also record that sacred ceremonial dances were associated with the area. The protected group contains 6 distinct figures at 3 locations, including 3 humans, 2 animals, and a spiral, with the largest human measuring about 171 feet from head to toe. That is far more useful than saying the builders were completely unknown. They were not members of a vanished species or representatives of an imaginary civilization that somehow developed advanced aircraft but forgot to leave a single engine behind. They were people living within the cultural world of the lower Colorado River, where land, water, travel, ceremony, and creation traditions were closely connected. The uncertainty begins when we try to move from that regional understanding to one exact community at one exact moment. Modern tribal names and boundaries do not necessarily reproduce the political landscape of 1,000 years ago. Communities moved, exchanged knowledge, formed families, shared ceremonies, and sometimes came into conflict. A sacred place could be maintained by descendants of its builders, adopted by related people, or used by several groups who recognize the same creator and journey. Knowing the identity of the being shown in a figure is also different from knowing the identity of every person who made it. A church may be dedicated to a named saint, while the individual workers who built its walls remain unknown. At Blythe, Mastamho's name may survive through tradition, even though the names of those who cleared the torso, marked the fingers, and carried stones to the edges have disappeared. The figures also refuse to provide one clean construction date. The Bureau of Land Management gives a broad estimated age of approximately 450 to 2,000 years. That range is not the result of archaeologists being unable to agree on which calendar they are using. It reflects the unusual problem of dating an image made by rearranging old stones on an old surface. The stones do not begin their lives when someone moves them. A pebble pushed into the border of a giant arm may already have rested in the desert for thousands of years. Dating the rock itself would therefore reveal nothing about the day the arm was made. The soil beneath the figure is older still. Archaeologists need to identify changes that occurred after the stones were disturbed, which is considerably more difficult than dating a piece of charcoal sealed inside a fireplace. Rock varnish offers part of an answer. When a stone is moved or overturned, a newly exposed surface can gradually acquire a thin, dark coating. Researchers can examine the chemistry and microscopic layering of that coating to estimate a minimum age for the disturbance. Recent work has continued to develop varnish lamination, lead profile and Cachen ratio methods for dating desert features, while also emphasizing that these approaches have limits and have been the subject of scientific disagreement. A minimum age tells us that the movement happened at least a certain length of time ago. It does not prove that construction happened in that exact year. Varnish may take time to begin forming, and different parts of one stone can weather differently. A sample from a repaired section might record a later renewal rather than the first design. Scientific equipment may be extremely precise when measuring the material placed before it, but it cannot politely ask the stone which episode of construction it represents. This possibility of renewal may be one of the most important things the Intaglios refuse to clarify. The figures could have been visited and repaired over many generations. Wind-blown dust would soften the contrast. Loose stones would move back into the cleared areas. People using the site could restore the pale lines, strengthen the gravel borders, or replace stones in meaningful positions. If the outlines were renewed, then asking when a figure was made becomes similar to asking when an old house was built after its walls, floor and roof have all been repaired at different times. The original plan may be ancient. One arm may preserve an early surface. The torso may have been cleared again centuries later. A mound could have been rebuilt during another visit. All these actions would belong to the same figure without sharing one date. We do not know whether the three human forms were created during one organised project. Their repeated style suggests a shared tradition, but they face different directions and lie at separate locations. The animal forms could have been made with the humans or added afterwards. The spirals and cleared circles may belong to the same ceremonial arrangement, or some may be older features reused when the larger bodies were made. Overlapping lines can sometimes reveal which design came first, but the Blythe surfaces have been altered by weather, visitors, and vehicles. Early aerial photographs preserve details that have since become faint, although even those images were taken long after the original activity ended. They show a particular condition of the site, not its untouched beginning. The modern record starts in 1932, when pilot George Palmer noticed the figures while looking for a possible emergency landing place. Army Air Corps photographs then helped researchers study the enormous forms. A National Park Service historical account records that early officials already recognised how easily thoughtless visitors could damage them and argued that they needed protection. That discovery story remains useful, but it also hides something. Palmer discovered the figures for museums, newspapers, government agencies, and a wider non-Indigenous audience. He did not discover them for the people whose cultural traditions were tied to the Colorado River landscape. The Intaglios had not been waiting in total human isolation for an aircraft to arrive. They had been waiting for a particular kind of official attention. We cannot know how many local people had seen them before 1932. Some may have walked across the terraces without understanding the full outlines. Others may have known the figures and their associations through family or ceremonial knowledge. Written records usually preserve the moment an institution becomes interested, not every earlier moment when a place was recognised, avoided, visited or discussed. The original names of the individual figures may also be gone from public knowledge. Blythe Intaglios is a modern label based on a nearby city and a European word for an incised design. It is convenient for road signs and databases. It tells us nothing about what the builders called the three locations, whether each human had a separate name, or whether the animal figures were described differently during particular ceremonies. Even the name Mastamho appears in several written forms because outsiders attempted to represent indigenous sounds with English spelling. Kumastamho, Mustamho, and other versions occur in different records. Variation does not mean the people had forgotten the name. It usually means the alphabet and the person holding the pencil were both doing their best under imperfect circumstances. The sounds that once accompanied the site are harder to recover than the names. If songs were performed during dances or pilgrimages, most left no physical mark. Archaeological research has connected Lower Colorado River intaglios with important mythic locations, ritual trails, cleared dance spaces, cairns, and a pilgrimage route following the journey of Kumastamho through the landscape. These interpretations draw on discussions with native consultants, as well as the arrangement of archaeological features. Yet recognizing a place of singing and dancing does not restore the performance. We do not know the rhythm of the steps at Blythe. We do not know where each participant stood, or whether everyone was allowed to enter the outlines. We cannot hear the words spoken beside the human figures or determine how one movement led to the next. A cleared circle may have been a dance area, but the gravel does not show whether the dancers moved clockwise, crossed the centre, or remained around the edge. A spiral could have guided movement, represented part of a creation event, or served another purpose understood by people who already knew its meaning. Its shape alone cannot translate it. The same silence surrounds the bodies themselves. Early researchers tried to classify some figures as male or female based on mounds, depressions, or stones placed within the lower torso. Those interpretations remain uncertain. The forms may represent creator beings whose bodies were not intended to match ordinary human anatomy. A raised feature could mark sex, an offering location, a ceremonial point, or something no surviving public explanation identifies. The lines beside the heads are usually described as hair, and they may well have represented hairstyles familiar to the makers. They could also indicate ornaments or another conventional feature. Without a contemporary explanation, a description such as hair remains reasonable but not final. The animals present the same problem. The available cultural interpretation identifies them with Hatakulia, a mountain lion person associated with creation. Their simplified outlines, however, have also encouraged comparisons with horses, dogs, wolves, coyotes, and other quadrupeds. The figures contain too little anatomical detail to settle the question through paws, hooves, teeth, or tails. They are not wildlife illustrations waiting to be filed under the correct species. Their relationship with the nearby humans is also unclear. They stand beside the creator figures, but the surviving arrangements show no obvious actions such as hunting, riding, attacking, or pulling. The relationship may have been explained through story, song, or movement rather than through the posture of the ground images. The intended viewpoint remains another persistent question. From an aircraft, the human bodies become immediately clear. From the ground, the visitor sees pale strips, gravel ridges, stones, and individual sections of limbs. This difference continues to encourage claims that the figures were messages for beings in the sky. No evidence requires that explanation. Large features can be planned with stakes, cords, measured steps, and shared instructions. More importantly, the makers did not need to discover the shapes from one distant viewpoint. They already knew what they were creating. The complete figure could exist in memory and tradition, while each worker saw only the section immediately in front of them. Still, the precise role of visibility cannot be dismissed completely. The builders chose a scale far beyond the human body. The figures may have been intended for spiritual beings as well as people on the ground. Many cultures make offerings that are buried, placed on roofs, or otherwise hidden from ordinary viewers. An object does not have to be seen by a human audience to be meaningful. What remains unsupported is the confident claim that aircraft, extraterrestrial visitors, or forgotten advanced technology were needed. The construction is fully consistent with people moving shallow surface gravel. The difficult part is cultural interpretation, not engineering. Saying that aliens made the figures because their meaning is uncertain is a little like blaming aliens for an unfamiliar recipe, because the cook failed to leave the instructions. The Intaglios also refused to reveal how many related figures have disappeared. The famous group is only one part of a wider Lower Colorado River tradition. Early researchers and later surveys documented many human, animal, geometric and linear ground features across the region. Some were damaged by roads, railways, military activity, agriculture, vehicles, construction, and unrecorded visits. Others may remain too faint to recognize. Aerial photographs and modern mapping can reveal traces that are difficult to see from the ground. Drone surveys, careful photogrammetry, archival images, and chemical studies may continue to identify lines, compare damage, and improve minimum age estimates. New methods can tell us more about how surfaces changed and which features may have been constructed together. Technology cannot recover everything. A perfect three-dimensional model would still show only the arrangement of the ground. It would not reveal a song unless that song survived elsewhere. A more accurate date would not identify the person who designed the figure. A microscopic analysis of one ridge would not explain who was permitted to cross it. Some knowledge may survive within indigenous communities without being available for unrestricted public use. Sacred information does not become the property of every curious visitor simply because archaeologists would find it helpful. Communities may choose what can be shared, who can hear it, and how particular places should be discussed. Respecting that choice is not an obstacle to understanding. It is part of understanding what a living sacred tradition means. Modern audiences often treat unanswered questions as failures. We expect every museum label to give a date, culture, purpose, and confident interpretation in a few neat lines. A phrase such as ceremonial function uncertain can feel unsatisfying, rather like opening a detective novel and finding that the final page has been replaced by a parking receipt. The Blythe Intaglios do not fit easily into that format. Their broad meaning is clearer than their details. They belong to a creation landscape associated with Lower Colorado River peoples. Their figures represent powerful beings rather than random oversized people and animals. The surrounding trails and cleared areas support ceremonial movement, dancing, and pilgrimage. Their construction required planning but no impossible technology. Beyond that, certainty begins to narrow. We do not know whether the first lines were laid out by one generation or several. We do not know whether the figures were visited every year, once in a lifetime, or only when a particular ceremony required it. We do not know whether the three sites formed a fixed sequence. We do not know how the spirals were understood. We do not know which details were renewed and which survived from the original clearing. That remaining uncertainty should not reduce the site to a blank mystery. There is a large difference between saying we know nothing and admitting that we know only part of the story. The first statement ignores archaeology, indigenous tradition, and the physical evidence. The second treats them honestly. The figures reveal that the desert was never an empty wasteland. It was observed closely enough for people to understand which terraces would preserve cleared lines. It was travelled often enough for ceremonial routes to connect important locations. It was known through names and stories that turned mountains, river crossings, animals, and open ground into parts of an organised world. They reveal that large monuments do not have to be built upward. Most familiar monuments resist gravity. They pile stone on stone, raise columns, or carve walls. The Blythe makers did the opposite. They removed a shallow surface and used contrast to create bodies across the ground. Their work is only a few inches deep, yet one figure extends farther than many towers are high. They reveal that simple tools can produce lasting results when the landscape is understood. No engines, cranes, or metal blades were necessary. The makers needed knowledge, cooperation, and enough reason to continue moving stones under a desert sun. Whatever else remains uncertain, the effort was deliberate. they also reveal how fragile an ancient place can be. The figures survived centuries of weather, only to suffer rapid damage after becoming widely publicised. The fences around them are not especially elegant, but they keep vehicles and footsteps away from surfaces where a few displaced stones can erase information. The barriers protect not a structure of massive blocks, but a careful difference between one patch of gravel and another. Perhaps the greatest thing the Intaglios refuse to reveal is the exact experience of standing there when the place was active. We can imagine people approaching along a trail and gathering near the cleared circles. We can picture hands pushing dark pebbles away from pale soil. We can think about songs crossing the terrace and dancers moving beside the long human bodies. But imagination must stop before it turns into evidence. We cannot place exact words into the mouths of people who did not leave them for us. We cannot recreate a private ceremony from the shape of a spiral. We cannot assume that a modern observer's emotional response matches that of an ancient participant. That restraint may feel less exciting than a grand solution, but it gives the site room to remain what it is, a culturally connected ancient landscape whose broad significance survives, while many details do not. Mystery does not have to mean that every explanation is equally likely. It means that evidence allows some answers, rejects others, and leaves a final group of questions open. And so we return to the largest human figure stretched across the terrace. Its head rests within a pale outline. Lines extend from its sides. Its arms reach outward, its legs separate below the long torso, and an animal form occupies the same desert setting. From above, the arrangement appears clear. From the ground, it breaks into sections again. That changing view is a useful way to understand everything we have encountered. At a distance, the Blythe Intaglios look like one simple mystery. Who made the giant figures? Closer inspection divides that question into many smaller ones involving age, community, construction, renewal, ceremony, pilgrimage, territory, oral tradition, preservation, and the limits of archaeological evidence. Some answers have emerged. Others may improve as new research continues and as descendant communities decide what knowledge can be shared. A few may never become available because the physical traces are gone, or because some parts of the tradition were never intended for the general public. The figures do not need to surrender every secret to remain valuable. Their importance does not depend on producing one surprising solution at the end. They matter because they preserve a relationship between people, story, and land at an extraordinary scale. They remind us that a landscape can hold history without ruins, writing, or walls. Now, after travelling from the first aerial photographs to the gravel beneath the figures, from Mastamho and Hatakulia to rock varnish and ceremonial roots, you're a little farther along your own evening than when we began. Perhaps the desert outside Blythe is still bright beneath the California sun, or perhaps night has already settled over the terraces and the giant forms are almost impossible to distinguish from the surrounding ground. Wherever you are listening from, I hope this slow journey has offered something more satisfying than a quick claim about aliens, giants, or a civilization no one can identify. The real story is quieter, but it is also richer. It concerns indigenous communities whose histories remain connected to the Colorado River, people capable of planning enormous designs with straightforward methods, and sacred places that continue to carry meaning long after the first stones were moved. If you found this journey calming or interesting, you might consider liking the video and subscribing to Just About Earth. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who enjoy old landscapes, careful questions and mysteries that do not need to shout in order to hold our attention. For now, the figures can remain where they have rested through so many seasons, their pale lines surrounded by dark gravel, their complete shapes visible only when distance brings the pieces together. We may never learn the name of the first person who marked the ground, the words of the songs once performed there, or the exact purpose of every circle and spiral. But we can recognise the care required to create them, the traditions that still give them context, and the responsibility involved in leaving them undisturbed. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are tonight, while the giant figures beside the Colorado River continue their long and patient watch beneath the desert sky.